Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this introductory session on climate-related financial disclosure. This is a virtual foundation level workshop. That's predominantly aimed at asset managers, but I know we're also expecting some other participants. So welcome all. We are just admitting people from the waiting room. So it might take just a minute or so just to get everyone in, and then I'll do the formal introduction. Okay, it is 32 minutes past, so I think we can start now. I expect some more people will be joining us as we go along, and that is completely fine. So as I said, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is, kind of follow on in a series of webinars that we're doing to introduce climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa and climate change and how that influences investment decisions, on both the physical and transition risk side. So before we start, just a couple of admin issues. As always, if you're not speaking, please keep your microphone and video on mute, just to make it a bit easier to avoid any feedback. If you have any questions, it'd be great if you could post them in the chat box. We will be answering some questions between speakers, as sections end, and we'll also be keeping some questions for the Q&A at the end of the session. So it'll be great if you could do that. The workshop will be recorded. It will be shared with participants afterwards. If you're having any technical difficulties, if you're struggling, with sound or anything like that, please give Safako, an email at the address on the screen currently, and he'll try and sort it out. And then, thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to an interactive and interesting session. Just a quick overview. You will all have the agenda that will be sent to you with your registration. As you'll see, we've got a jam-packed agenda for today. We'll start off with a welcome introduction and the project overview, which I will handle, and then we'll hand over to our esteemed panel of speakers, which I'll introduce in a second. So there is going to be a couple of breaks during the day, just so you know, as you'll see from the agenda. So at 20 to 11, there will be a quick comfort break, and then there will be a longer break at 20 to 12, just to give you a chance to kind of refresh and get ready for the rest of the session. And as I mentioned, there is a dedicated question and answer session, but please feel free to pop your questions in the chat box in the meantime, and we'll go through them as we're presenting, and then we'll address some of them. And also, if you don't mind, it'll be great if you could pop your name and just where you're from in the chat box, just so people know who's on the call. There is going to be an interactive exercise later on where we're going to ask you to do that again. But of course, if it's in the chat box, then it's easy to refer back to, at the end of the session. We'll, stick to timing very closely. So we will be ending at 10 to 2, and so we are looking forward to beginning the chat. So the beginning of discussion. So before I give you the formal introduction to the project and all of that, I think I'll start off by just giving you a quick introduction to our esteemed speakers. We've got a very exciting and jam-packed panel roster of speakers today. Firstly, from WWF, we have Sarah Mudry, who's an investment analyst within the sustainable finance team and business development unit. Sarah has worked for leading insurance and asset management companies in previous roles on strategy, sustainability, research, and responsible investing. That's Sarah over there. So since joining WWF in 2016, he's been working on integrating environmental risk management principles into investment management, promoting sustainable finance, and developing green financial solutions. Sarah also currently sits on investment committees for the Green Outcomes Fund and the Sanlam Living Planet Fund, and is part of the WWF team working on the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. So we're very fortunate to have Sarah here. As you see, he is steeped in both climate change and in investment. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Sarah. Then we also have Melanie Smith with us. Melanie Smith is the practice head, research and reporting at Six Capitals. In this role, Melanie heads up, the ESG research and reporting capacity in supporting Six Capital's clients. So that's the project we're presenting today, and also, some other very, important clients. Melanie led the Six Capital's research process into the WWF and Sanlam supported research piece into the state of TCFD reporting in South Africa, which is a really great piece of research. So if you haven't seen that, that's definitely something to look into. Then we're also very fortunate to have with us Professor Brett Cohen. Brett has worked on the broad area of sustainability assessment and implementation for over 20 years. He's a co-director of the Greenhouse, a consultancy in Cape Town, where his consulting services include the TCFD, Sustainable Development Goals, CDP reporting, and also a host of other issues around sustainability, climate change, and also how that influences investment decisions and firm decision making. He's also an expert at stakeholder engagement and training, and I'm sure we'll see all of those skills coming through today. Brett is also a honorary professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Cape Town. And then also, very impressively, Brett has been appointed as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sixth assessment report. We'll try and not focus exclusively on that today, but if you have the odd question there, please feel free. I'm sure Brett will not mind dealing with that. Brett holds a BSc and PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Cape Town. So Brett, welcome and thank you very much for your time. And then last but not least, we have my colleague Adrian Bertrand. He's a co-founder and practice head, ESG advisor at Six Capitals Advisory. But prior to that, Adrian worked as the head for Africa and Middle East for the UN-supported Principles of Responsible Investment. He also served as an ESG manager at the Government Employees Pension Fund, and currently serves part-time consultant to ACISA, where he serves, as a secretariat for the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa. In this capacity, Adrian is currently chairs the CRISA Stewardship Code Review Working Group. So Adrian, thank you very much for joining us. And once I've done the introduction, introduce you to the project and our funder, Adrian will then take over to facilitate the rest of the session, and he'll also be handling the Q&A at the end. So as you can see, we've tried to bring together a group that brings both kind of intellectual rigor, but also an understanding of kind of practicalities around investment and ESG issues in South Africa. So just to give you, before we kick off, introduce our speakers, I'll give you a quick introduction to the project and also the bigger funding program. This project is graciously funded by the UK PAC, which is the Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. It's a UK government fund delivered by BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's one of the UK's core international climate funding activities, and the purpose of UK PACT is to support the achievement of nationally determined contributions in emerging markets, and to help limit dangerous climate change. Now, as you'll see throughout the presentation, PACT is a demand-driven process. So the focus is really on identifying the country needs in the country partners, and then addressing those needs. And so PACT works very closely with its country partners. It's trying to facilitate not only mitigation, but also inclusive growth in order to reduce emissions. It's trying to address barriers and constraints to clean growth, and ultimately wants to do all of this in order to support greater climate ambition. Now, UK PACT is run through a number of projects, and there is a number of country programs through which South Africa is one of these country programs. There are also country programs, as you can see, in China, Colombia, Malaysia, Mexico, and Mexico. So we're really fortunate to be in this group of countries. And then there's also a Green Recovery Challenge Fund and a skill share and secondment scheme being run by UK PACT to try and embed some useful skills and knowledge from the UK's experience in their partner countries. Now, in terms of the South Africa program, it was launched in July 2020. More than 10 projects have been funded, for well over £3 million of funding. Most of the projects are in the spheres of energy, sustainable transport, and then sustainable finance. And the project we're presenting today is one of the sustainable finance projects, and I'll tell you more about that. If you want any more information on UK PACT and South African activities, there's a website address on the screen. If you go there, you'll learn all about UK PACT and what it's doing. There's a number of different resource portals, and like I say, UK PACT is doing some really interesting stuff, not only in South Africa but also in the other country partners. Well, so that's our funder and the broad context in terms of this specific project. Our aim is to try and embed the use of climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa in order to generate relevant information that can be used in asset allocation and investment decisions. So we're trying to identify and address the barriers to climate-related financial analysis and also importantly to reporting. And we're doing this in line with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. Now, what we've tried to do in terms of putting the project team together is we wanted to have international best practice combined with a deep understanding of the South African context of both the ESG context and also in terms of climate change mitigation. And you'll see that a bit later on. When I show you the partners of the project, and also in Professor Cohen's presentation, he will also introduce some follow-up training, which we, with one of our international partners, will be holding on scenario analysis, towards the end of the month. So really, the purpose of this project is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and time-based climate-related disclosures in investment decision-making in South Africa. So we want to avoid stranded assets. We want to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy, and we also want to support low carbon green growth in South Africa. The current focus of this project is very much on transition risk. It will be explained to you in a little bit. We're focusing on listed equities and the impact on asset management and the pension fund industries, but we're hoping that in future we can expand this to other asset classes and also other instruments. We will also be looking at physical risk, briefly as part of this project, with the eye on identifying the barriers to doing physical risk assessment, and then identifying those and hopefully addressing them in a future project. But then what we're trying to get out of today is obviously we want to impart some knowledge on you, but we also want to listen to you in terms of what your needs are in your day-to-day operation and what tools and information you feel is lacking in terms of supporting your analysis and also reporting of climate-related financial disclosure, of climate-related financial information. As I mentioned, we've already, we've tried to put together a team, of international and local best practice. We've already been introduced, to the greenhouse where Professor Cohen is from, and also to Six Capitals Advisory, where Melanie and Adrian is from. We're also very fortunate to have, Sarah and WWF South Africa, supporting us on as a part of this project. Of course, they bring a wealth of information in terms of international best practice and also what's happening in South Africa. Then we've also very fortunate to have Vivid Economics based in the UK as part of our team. Vivid has done some of the leading work internationally, looking at analyzing the impact of both physical and transition risk on investment portfolios in both the banking and investment areas. And as I mentioned, they will also be running very practical training on the use of scenario analysis in terms of TCFD towards the end of the month. And then I'm Brent Kluter, so I haven't introduced myself. I'm from DNA Economics. I run the climate change and energy practice there. And we've been involved in climate change, mitigation and policy making in South Africa for well over a decade. And that's, part of the reason why with this team of very esteemed organizations, we decided to put this project forward, because there is a lot of work being done in South Africa, particularly in the policy space, looking at these issues, which often isn't publicly available and often isn't translated into, or often isn't publicly available, but also isn't translated into kind of useful information that can be applied in decision making. Now, just quickly run you through the project structure. Our core supporters are Batseta and ASISA, so the Investment and Pension Fund Industries Associations, and then also the JSE. And we also have a very large advisory group of organizations that we consult regularly to make sure the project is more broadly relevant, to the financial sector in South Africa. Then we have a whole list of activities, and we structure those around the different levels of engagement. So today you are already quite far down the pyramid in terms of foundation level training. We've also have a number of webinars, shorter webinars we ran earlier, and there's also a number of information pieces that we're circulating, and I'll tell you all about that when we move on to exactly what we're trying to do in terms of this project. So there are really three streams to this project. The first one is basic, capacity building and awareness raising, which is part of what we're doing today. So currently we're doing the foundation level training. Towards the end of the year, we'll also be running a series of advanced training workshops that will be highlighting tools we've developed as part of this project, and also providing more practical advice on how to do these, how to do this kind of analysis. In order to support that, we are also developing a climate analysis toolkit. is there to support decision making and disclosure with South Africa specific information and guidance. And as part of the session today, particularly Brett will also be asking you questions around that. So as I said, we're hoping this will be an interactive session. We're trying to impart you with knowledge, but we're also trying to understand exactly what we can do further to make your lives easier, and what needs you have in terms of data sources, information processing facilities, or even tools in order to do data processing. And then the third stream of the project is something which we're very excited about. And specifically one of the reasons why we partnered with Vivid Economics and their sister company Pronetrics is we are calculating the transition risk inherent in the portfolio of 50 of the most heavily invested companies on the JSE. We are then going to use that information to do a TCFD compliant best practice disclosure example, which will show in terms of South Africa both the kind of level of transition risk that investors and also asset owners are exposed to, but will also show exactly what's already possible in South Africa. So we're trying to show that there is quite sophisticated analysis is already possible with the information that's out there at the moment, and also to show how we've addressed data gaps and issues around scenario trading in particular. So we're very excited, and we would like you to join us on this journey through this project. And in order to facilitate that, we've created a dedicated project space, which is on the DNA Economics website, where we've put all the information sources we've already we've currently put out, and you'll see there's a number of information pieces already on that website. There is a piece of information, a piece looking at international best practice for financial institutions. There's also a report looking at climate financial disclosure in South Africa. What's been done, what's driving it, what are the barriers, and so forth. And we also then, our colleagues, 6 companies in WWF, looked at 54 of the largest companies on the JSE and assessed the level of climate disclosure that they're currently providing, and provide information on where you can find more information on this disclosure. And these climate fact sheets, as they're called, are also all listed and all publicly available on the website. And I guess that's another point, is to make all the tools we're developing, all the resources are publicly available and open source, so you can download all of them from the website. And then all this information was also pulled together by our colleagues, at 6 Capitals, into a very impressive summary publication, a special edition of the Atleha-edu publication, which is really, pulled all of this together in a very easy to engage with way, in a very, very user-friendly way. So that's a great introduction to this area for everyone who maybe hasn't attended some of the earlier webinars or the session today. We also have recordings of all the 4 shorter webinars as foundation level webinars we provided earlier, in this month and the previous month. So you can also download those from the website. We'll have to see about these sessions. They might be a little bit large to actually host on the website, but as I said, recordings will be made available to all the participants. So yeah, so that is the introduction. I will hand you over to my colleague Seren Mudri from WWF now. Just to reiterate, please, we want this to be an interactive session. So Seren will start off with a little exercise, but also if you have any questions in the chat, please pop them in there. We'll keep an eye on that. We'll try and address them as we go along. And for those who've already mentioned who they are and where they're from, great. We very appreciate that. I'm seeing there's quite a few people have already done that. If any of you haven't, if you could please just pop that information in the chat functionality. And then yes, thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to a great session. And I will hand over to Seren, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Brent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. As Brent mentioned, there's a bit of engagement or exercise that we're going to ask from the audience today. There's a link that Milani has put into the chat to a Jamboard. If you click onto that, it should open up a browser to Google, and it's a little online interactive whiteboard that we wanted to trial out for today, and just to get participants to give us some feedback wherever necessary. So if you click on the link, the first page will be a whiteboard, and you'll see on your left-hand side, there's a little panel there. It might be good if I share my screen, and then you can see how it works. Let's see if that works. You'll see a little panel on the side, and there's some options there where you can put in a sticky note. So hopefully you can see my screen. There's that panel, there's a sticky note, and you can write your name and organization. And then that sticky note pops up, and then you can add in your name or organization here like we've done. But what we really want to hear from you is on the second page. So if you click this icon at the top here to the right, what do you want to get out of today's workshop? And we see someone's put in a sticky note here already. You can click one of the sticky note icon here and add in what you want to get from today's workshop. If there's any other comments, questions, thoughts, things you'd like to share, things that, you know, in a normal day and age where we had these physical workshops, we could just take a sticky and put it onto our flip chart. Well, we can't do that anymore, but we have this quite cool tool to use and to ask you to put down and jot down your thoughts in a, you know, you can pick different colors, you can pick different fonts in a more engaging way. And just to say that you will be anonymous, so your name is not actually here. You come up as an anonymous anteater or cheetah or something cool like that. So yeah, hopefully we can hear a bit more from you on the Jamboard and get you thinking and engaging with us. So from that, I'd like to jump into my session. Let me know if you guys can see my screen. I'm going to share it now. Great. So good morning, everyone, again. My name is Seren Madhuri from WWF South Africa. I'm an investment analyst there, and my colleague Brent introduced me earlier today. Thank you all for joining today's session and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today at this workshop. We wanted to start with an introduction to climate change because many may be familiar with the concept, but maybe may not be, but most will potentially agree that the impacts of climate change present a real risks for our lives. And business leaders themselves have been noting that, as you can see from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report that was produced this year, but it's produced everywhere. Climate action failure comes up as a top risk amongst business leaders and leaders worldwide. And this has been coming up for a number of years now. And if you actually circle all the risks that relate to environmental damage and is linked to climate change, then that map starts to get a lot scarier. And it means that the need for action becomes more urgent. And that's why we're here today. A part of the reason why we're here today is to address some of these things. But in order to do that, it's good to get some key foundational concepts in the climate change sphere for everyone to understand and ground us as we go into things that might become a bit more technical or specific, detailed later. So the foundational concepts are quite important. Starting off with definitions of greenhouse gases. So there are 3 levels to this: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Many of you might be familiar with this concept, many might not be, but these scopes are part of the greenhouse gas definition protocols. And it's important that we understand that for disclosure purposes as asset managers, as if you're allocating assets or if you're measuring your own portfolio's footprint, then scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are important to understand. So scope 1 emissions refer to those activities that are directly under the control of the company, where scope 2 emissions refer to those that are a bit more indirect, so refer to specifically those emissions that are resulted from purchasing of electricity that's used by the company. And scope 3 are the all indirect emissions that occur through a company's supply chain or value chain. So it's a bit more difficult to map out scope 3 emissions, but it's still an important component of the overall carbon footprint of any business or any investment or any lending activity. Then on to sources and sinks of carbon. So we've defined carbon on the previous slide, or greenhouse gas emissions on the previous slide, but we know that since industrialization has been occurring since about the mid 1700s onwards, human activity has been increasingly releasing amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, these gases trap heat, which leads to global warming, which also causes climate change. The gases accumulate in the air over time and get more and more concentrated in the atmosphere, trapping more and more heat. And, we've defined, we normally talk about carbon dioxide. This is the most common greenhouse gas that's released. Another major greenhouse gas is methane, which is released from livestock, rubbish in landfills, rotting things. And, different greenhouse gases have varying impacts on warming, varying impacts on climate change. So to be able to compare these emissions of gases, they're converted to a common basis called carbon dioxide equivalent, often talked about in shorthand as carbon emissions. So that's why carbon kind of encapsulates a lot of greenhouse gases beneath it, but we're actually talking about CO2 equivalent. So when we talk about the sources of carbon from human activity, fossil fuel and industry emitting lots of different greenhouse gases, but we kind of talk about that in terms of carbon emissions, even though it's carbon and other things. So carbon, we measure greenhouse gases in CO2 equivalent. But there are also carbon sinks, right? So we emit GHG gases or CO2 from fossil fuel and industry, from land use change, but the land and vegetation and soil actually acts as a carbon sink, absorbing or storing more carbon than they emit. So changing the way we use land or the way we use the ocean, which is also a massive carbon sink, similar to the land. If we destroy the sinks so that they can no longer absorb carbon, and by releasing the carbon they've stored, that's going to contribute further to climate change. So we have to reduce carbon emissions from human activities and maintain these sinks to prevent climate change beyond what humans can cope with. And this is often called mitigation. It's important to highlight fossil fuels because these are almost synonymous with the climate change issue. We know that there are tons of reserves of oil, natural gas, coal situated across the globe. Different countries, and it's shown on this map which countries have large share of those fossil fuel reserves. And we know that if we burn those fossil fuel reserves that's remaining, these non-renewable resources, that we will burn and create enough CO2 equivalent, that's going to cause irreversible climate change, and which will lead to significant degradation of our livelihoods and our planet. And this slide shows that. It illustrates kind of what the impacts of climate change will be. And it also on this slide shows why we need to talk about 1.5 degrees as an important climate change target. So you can read here on the slide about what the extreme weather events or water availability or the impact of climate change on species and people would be. The high risks of floods, the impacts on species in terms of biodiversity loss, what's going to happen to our water. These are all scary stats. And the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the UN IPCC, they released a special report a couple of years ago on why we need to look at 1.5 degrees as a target. The Paris Agreement talks about 2 degrees as a target. What that means is, compared to pre-industrialized life on Earth, the Earth could warm 2 degrees as a result of climate change within the next generation. And this warming of 2 degrees will have significant impacts on our planet, as shown on the slide. But if we go for 1.5 degrees, then the impacts of this warming over the last 200-300 years will be much more livable for us compared to 2 degrees. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is substantial in terms of the impact it's going to have on the planet and our lives. And that's what the slide is showing. Moving on to the concept of carbon budgets. Now, the slide might be a little bit confusing, but effectively, we're emitting carbon every year. And, we want to look at how do we decrease the amount of carbon that we are emitting. We know that we're on a trajectory where carbon emissions are kind of increasing year by year, and we need that to stop. But we obviously know, realistically speaking, that we can't just automatically stop emitting carbon, right? We all use electricity, we all drive from A to B. It's just, we need to actually stop the increase in the emissions. And then once we stop the increase in emissions, we need to move downwards, and we need to then, to come to a point of net zero. So that's where we're sucking and storing carbon out of the atmosphere, sinking it in the ground, ocean, and in other new technologies, capturing that carbon, so that eventually by 2050, we hope we get to a point where we are net zero carbon, and we will hopefully be within that 1.5 degree target. And that is, we want ambitious action to make sure that we reduce we move onto a trajectory where we're going towards net zero. And underneath this, where that black clouds are, that's kind of where our carbon budget sits, right? We need to stay underneath that. That's our kind of carbon budget in terms of how much carbon we can use. So to stabilize at a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target, for a 67% chance of reaching that target, we can't emit more than 400 gigatons of CO2. So that's ever, right? So that means it's 12 years of 2018 emissions. So we've only got 12 years of 2018 emissions. And this is from 2020 on. So I think that's now 11 years, because we're almost at the end of the year. And then for a 50% chance, you got a little bit more carbon dioxide in the budget. But it's very scary if you think about it. It's not a long-term issue. And that's why the need for urgent action is pressing, because the numbers kind of are quite scary. I'd like to pause here to take a quick poll and a quick question for the audience is, how confident would you feel in engaging in a discussion on climate risk? So 1, you're not confident at all, or the last option, which is very confident. So a moment for everyone to answer this poll.
Darren, Melanie here. While our participants are completing the poll, I just wanted to mention, I see there's some nice kind of thoughts around what people would like to see discussed today, and things they have on their mind that they'd like to get out of today's session on the second slide of that Jamboard. So I have been steadily working through some of these, trying to make some very short notes, but I see a lot of the comments or questions people want to chat about or have on their mind. We will be touching on throughout today's session in some shape or form. But yeah, great to see that there's a number of similar concerns that the attendees have, that we are also grappling with as people that work in this industry.
Thanks, Melanie. Yes, I can't see the Jamboard at the moment because I'm sharing my screen, but I appreciate the feedback there, Melanie, and appreciate everyone going onto the Jamboard and filling out your responses there. And it's also good to know that what on top of mind for the audience is some of the things we're going to be discussing today. For those who've entered the poll, if you're not feeling too confident, or if you're not confident at all, we hope that the rest of the session could help you out a little bit more in your understanding of climate change risk, climate-related risks. And for those who are a bit confident, we hope that we can move you on to the very confident level. As we see, there's no one who's very confident in the room today. Maybe some of my presenters would have been in that last bucket, but we hope to shift everyone further along this chain to improve your understanding of climate change and climate-related risks. So thank you for entering into that poll. On to the next part of the introduction to climate change is introducing two kinds of risks that commonly thought about in the climate change sphere. And these are physical and transition risks. So physical risks, they refer to things like flooding, drought, extreme heat, sea level rise, and wildfires, and some of the things I've showed on the previous slide talking about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Then another type of risk is transitional risks. This refers to the changing policies in response to climate change, changing legal environment in terms of liabilities that companies might face in response to climate change action, and then changing technologies. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in terms of the different types of transition risks. But all of these, both transitional and physical risk, have a potential to impact on businesses financially. And that's why we need to talk about climate change to a business audience, to an asset manager audience, because this is going to affect revenues, cash flows, investment values, diversification, all kinds of risk management metrics for asset managers and businesses alike. So physical risks refer to how physical impacts of climate change may impact financial performance now or in the future, and transition risks are risks that arise due to changing regulations, policies, technology, markets, and reputation linked to efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. Okay, another quick question for the audience today. Which of the following are not considered examples of the two major climate risk categories? So A, transition risk, B, personal risks, C, physical risks, or D, task risks. Great, so well done to those who said personal and task risks. That is correct. I think we had one response that said physical risks. No, physical risk is a major climate risk category. That's the things like droughts and heat waves, rising sea levels form part of physical risks. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll. And we've got another one. Yes, so we're keeping you on your toes here. Which of the following is not an example of damages or losses from extreme weather events? So is it long-term droughts, floods, resource efficiency, or sustained higher temperatures? Yeah, so everyone, most people seem to have picked resource efficiency. And that is the correct answer. So C, resource efficiency. So which of the following is not an example? Yeah, resource efficiency isn't an example of a damage from extreme weather events. It's more around long-term droughts, floods, and sustained higher temperatures. So thank you though for everyone who participated in the poll. Glad to see you're keeping up with us and keeping engaged. Just a brief note on climate policy, because this is an important part of transition side of things. If you look at carbon tax and carbon pricing, and this is a map for the globe, you'll see that there's various countries across the world that's either thinking about implementing a carbon tax or carbon pricing, or have already implemented it, or have a schedule to implement it. So it's coming across, this is just an example of one policy, which is around carbon tax, but there are many others. But you can see from this map that it's a global trend that especially in big markets like Europe, US, China, these kinds of carbon policies are only going to get more and more rigorous, are only going to get more and more common. What does it mean in the South African context? Well, on the policy side, we have the South African Sustainable Finance Initiatives, which is convened by National Treasury. And I wanted to touch on this because it's an important element of SA's climate change policy space. And it's specifically targeting the finance sector. So the National Treasury, after they released their sustainable finance working paper, they've also set up a number of working groups talking about financial instruments, talking about disclosure on TCFD, climate risk, as well as increasing capacity. So we can see at the Treasury level, at very high level, that climate change is on the agenda. And, you know, we even have a carbon tax in South Africa, as the previous slide showed. So the policy risks and the policy changes that are coming, you know, it's not going to be a surprise when they hit us. These things are in the pipeline for some time now. Use some useful tools. And we're going to talk about a number of tools throughout this project. But this is just to give you an overview of, just to highlight some tools that exist in terms of if you want to look at spatial data, talking about water risk as it relates to climate change, you can check out the water risk filter. You can plug it in your address, the type of business you're involved in, or the type of business you're looking to insure, underwrite, specifically for audience today, the type of business you're looking to lend and invest in. Then, you know, this is a useful tool to plop in an address, to plop in maybe a type of industry that you're involved in. And the South Africa specific water risk filter has some downscale data that can help you assess the risks that you're exposed to, from operational, basin, reputational, physical, on a spatial level as it relates to water and climate change. The Green Book is a similar kind of tool that's talking about municipalities in the country. So this has looked at all the municipalities in South Africa and assessed them from a kind of climate change risk perspective. So it's another useful tool out there. And like I said, we'll be talking a bit more about some tools later, and the toolkit that's coming out through this project might be of interest to, or will be of interest to, many of the participants here today. Where there are tools, there are also initiatives where people are coming together, or alliances. So the Alliance for Climate Action is one such alliance, an example of people from the business space coming together to collaborate on how to address climate-related risks. And one of the things about these alliances is that they set commitments for their members. So members commit to taking action on climate change, and they work together to support each other in achieving those commitments. Then there are initiatives that are a combination of tools and alliances, like the Science Based Target Initiative, where people come together, or there's, you know, it's a tool to help people set targets for their climate change reduction. We're going to talk a bit more about metrics and targets as one of the pillars of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations later, but I wanted to just put this primer out there that science-based targets, you know, it's one of those tools that companies can use across different industries, including the finance sector, to set targets to help them work towards that net zero, or their, you know, their own internal business targets that they're setting. And with that, I'd like to stop there. I think, you know, we're gonna take a break before we play this video, which is Sir Partha Dasgupta discussing sustainable finance. It might be a good time to also just stop to see if there's any questions, or, you know, if anyone wants to raise their hand or speak or ask anything. This might be a good break. So Melanie, I'll hand over to you, or Adrian, if you could direct me here if there's any questions we might want to deal with.
So Suren, not much questions coming through in the chat box as such, but like I mentioned, the Jamboard has a few thoughts on it, which is great. And I think some of the things that you've already touched on was some of these useful resources and tools that you've just shared. The Green Book I actually had a look at before we started the previous webinar series that we ran when Wendy shared it with me, and I found that to be a particularly useful tool. I think it maps out municipal level risk and various types of risks, not only climate related, I think, which is, I think, quite useful in the South African context, because data is an issue, I think, usually when making these types of decisions. And then the other things that I take note of were comments around how companies are using the TCFD reports and by which investors and stakeholders, and then guidance around climate-related risks and opportunities in investment decisions. So in that, we'll tackle, just after this break, we'll have a specific section on the TCFD guidance. They provide some nice supplementary guidance specifically for asset managers, which would be useful in today's session. Then I'm guessing this is probably from our participants from the Land Bank, questions around food security, and addressing those with funders, farmers and consumers. So I think that's a very valid question. I think specifically being you're operating in kind of this asset manager space, being allocators and people that drive kind of, the allocation of capital, that's an important discussion. And I mean, yeah, you guys are welcome if you want to chip in here and add additional questions. I don't think today's discussion is intended with, having people only comment on the Jamboard. You're welcome to raise your hand and put on your mic. Yeah, but so from the Jamboard, that's some of the questions people have asked, and I've tried to make a few comments there. You're welcome to add further comments there. Yeah. So Seren, we are a bit ahead of time. Maybe let's give people another opportunity. Anyone that wants to make a verbal comment or question before we head into a break? Okay. So nothing at this stage. We are ahead of time, so let's use this. Maybe people have a few phone calls or emails to answer, and we are back at 10 to 11 for the next session, which will then deal with the recommended disclosures for asset managers specifically, and then we'll also have use that session to do a nice individual exercise to look at what climate data is currently being disclosed. So we'll have around a 30-minute break and then get back into it 10 to 11.
Thanks, Melanie. See everyone a bit later.
Great. Thanks, guys. All right. And I see Nick is here with audio. What I'm going to do just now, before we start, is we're going to share a video with you guys. I'm going to share the link in the chat box just in case there's some audio issues. And you're welcome to, I see we have another person indicating in the back. So you're welcome to listen to this on your end if you're experiencing any audio issues. We've tested it on our end. It should be working, but let's see. So let me just first share my screen. And let's do this and play this video clip. Can everyone hear? Okay. I can't see.
It's not just our economies, but it's our entire life is built around nature because we are part of nature. We're not external to it. Nature provides us with clean water. It offers pollination services, which enable us to grow food. It circulates air, water. I can't think of anything that we do which is not founded on nature's processes. So if we jeopardize that, it's not just our economies that are in trouble. Our lives are in trouble. The demands we make of the goods and services that nature provides us exceeds its ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. We have had a good life. The last 70 years have been particularly favorable to the generation which has lived through this period. We have never had it so good. We live far longer than we ever did before. There are more of us. We're better educated. We're better fed. We travel a lot more. The flip side of it is that we've been living beyond our means, if you want to use a very standard imagery. And by our means, I mean that we are degrading the biosphere in order to do that. And so we've been living a terrifically buoyant life over the past 70 years by making the biosphere less habitable, less productive for our descendants. Ecosystems are assets, just as our road network is an asset, just as our educational system is an asset. So in talking about our relationship with nature, we're really talking about an asset management problem, balancing the various types of assets in our portfolio, and we are mismanaging that. The reason our financial systems do not take nature seriously in their calculations is because the information on the basis of which decisions are made does not contain much about nature. For example, we use GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure of the success of the community or society or a country. And yet the measure has nothing to say about what we are doing to nature. So the lens with which our institutions see their societies is one which doesn't notice nature. So keeping nature out of the formal models, the quantitative models that drive policy, has meant that we are able to imagine unlimited growth possibilities in our material standard of living. That carries with it the thought that humanity is external to nature, whereas we're, of course, embedded in it. And since nature is bounded, it's finite, it must be that the picture of unlimited growth possibilities is wholly flawed.
All right, so I am going to stop the clip there. I should have probably led with saying that this is a clip. I think, Siren, did you mention it's a WWF? Is it a film, a clip out of a film, the Too Big to Fail?
Yeah, it's part of a series that WWF did on sustainable finance with key experts. So if you go to the link, I think there's a playlist there, and Sapata as the first one, and then there's a few more experts that similar interviews they've conducted. It's quite a nice series. Little mealtime videos in case you're looking for something to watch in between meetings or while you're having a snack to eat at work. So it's quite a nice series if you want to check it out. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Siren, for that. Yeah, so this is a clip out of that film, and I think there's two reasons why we've played it. So I want to have used this as a segue between climate change and then heading into what disclosures, asset managers, and just what type of climate disclosures do we want to see, and that's been kind of led by organizations such as the TCFD that has provided a long list of guidelines and public documents to assist various stakeholders that need to either report or use climate data to make decisions, and to kind of make that link explicitly. But I also wanted to use this clip to test with our audience today, just having looked at this 3-4 minute clip that we just watched, what the initial thoughts were, given that they operate largely, I think many of you operate largely in the asset manager space, and yeah, to have a bit of a discussion around what your thoughts are on operating in this world, and what role do you think you have to play as investors that can possibly, through your role in the investment community, contribute to this low carbon economy that we need to move towards very urgently. And I think the other thing, having a quick look at our list, is that we do have a strong female presence, if I'm making my assumptions about gender names correctly. And I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to maybe just, if there's a few thoughts around you as a female working in this space, what your role is and how one can use that addressing things like gender equality, social inclusion of previously marginalized groups, and changing the narrative around, I know there's a lot of debate about the mandate takers as opposed to being mandate makers, and possibly contributing in some shape or form to this transition. Yeah, I can't see any at this stage because I'm sharing my screen, can't see any comments coming through. So I'd appreciate, Adrian, Siren, if you are able to guide me if there's thoughts around this or on the Jamboard.
Comments coming through yet?
Okay, and nothing on the Jamboard yet.
And just a reminder to participants that you can raise your hand, if you want to say anything, or if you don't have to put in the chat or the Jamboard, we can, enable your mic for you. In fact, you can unmute yourself, I think, and then just jump in.
So no thoughts around what roles asset managers are able to play in this transition? We have a very quiet audience this morning. Okay, well, I'll share a few thoughts, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. Siren, you have a good understanding as well of the investment world, so you're welcome to chip in if you have a few thoughts. Yeah, I guess with some of the research we've done, we've heard it quite a bit from the investor side, that, Siren, I'm thinking about that engagements we had as part of our Sanlam funded TCFD research we did together earlier this year and end of last year. A lot of investors mentioning that because they aren't mandate makers, they aren't able to kind of indicate to their clients where they should allocate their capital. And yeah, I find it quite interesting. I'm sure, although they can't mandate where capital should be allocated, I'm sure to some shape, yeah, to some degree, asset managers do have the ability to, point out to clients, where the best options are for, investing in organizations that do contribute to GESI issues, that maybe place that on their agenda, or report well on those type of metrics, or even just broadly address the transition to a lower carbon economy. Siren, I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. If I see Mila has her hand up, or his hand up. Mila, you're welcome to join the conversation. Hi, good morning.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for this webinar. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts from our side. So being at Athena Capital. So I think certainly it was noticeable perhaps maybe 18 or 24 months ago, asset owners sort of waking up to the sort of whole responsible investing, ESG sort of wave. And we've certainly seen increased pressure from asset owners around ESG. I think interestingly enough, we thought that perhaps the view of asset owners was more around regulatory compliance, and it was going to be very much a tick boxing exercise. And we thought that sort of the momentum would build over time. I think we've certainly been surprised. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work internally ourselves on our own sort of integration of investment process, but also a level of engagement with the investee companies. But I think what we've seen in the last 12 months is certainly an acceleration for companies. Up until now, it had almost seemed that companies were quite guarded and resistant, if I can call it that. But with the wave of reporting we've had in the last 12 months, we've been quite surprised by the number of companies that have actually come out, I guess, with sort of net zero targets or, detail around scope 1, 2, or 3 sort of targets as well. So it's certainly something that's gaining momentum. And so where initially, I think perhaps we thought the initial impact would be one of administrative burden on asset managers, I certainly think that it is something that has accelerated, and we do have a responsibility as asset owners, I think, to keep companies accountable. And so we've got to use the weight of the assets that we manage for asset owners to, I think, collaborate and partner a lot more with each other. And we've certainly seen a higher level of engagement amongst asset managers in wanting to collaborate on specific resolutions, for example. And I think the NASPA's process deal was a classic example. So yeah, I think those are, I know it's a lot of thoughts all in one, but just sort of how we kind of viewing the landscape.
Thanks, Mila, for your contribution. I think it's wonderful news to hear that we're really seeing momentum picking up amongst investors, because a few months ago, when we did our first initial research around the uptake of TCFD in South Africa, although we saw that reporters were a bit ahead, it seemed that there was still hesitancy from investors to really make strides in that regard. So it's great news to hear that there's been a push from asset owners, but also the excitement around collaborating and peers within the industry joining hands to see where they can work together and tackle the issue kind of as a collective, because I think that's probably one of the most important things when thinking about how one addresses it. It's not one or two companies and one or two countries that are responsible for addressing it. It's really everyone's responsibility. Siren, do you have any thoughts? Want to add, comment?
Yeah. I've really agreed with what's been coming up so far. I think from our engagements with the different stakeholders, the mandate issue comes up a lot, but I think the demand side and the supply side is gonna work together at a certain point. There's gonna come to a point where we reach an equilibrium on this, and I think we work into that point. And as individual companies, as asset managers, start to address this, challenge themselves to look at this issue, which they have been And it's like resources like the ones we're doing through this webinar and through this project. It's going to be tools for them to, increase their understanding of and, working their way through the different individuals within a company, and then filtering up and filtering through to the clients. So it's a process, Melania, and I think we're all on that process and that journey at the moment. So yeah, no, I agree with what's been happening so far. I see Anisha's made a comment in the chat talking about partnerships, how critical partnerships were. And I think Mila also referred to collaboration. And I agree with that 100%. I don't think there's any company there that has 100% of the knowledge. And I don't think there's any consultant or NGO out there that has 100% of the perspective of a company trying to tackle this. So it's about working together and coming together. Definitely critical parts of rising to this challenge.
Great, thanks, Siren. Any other comments or hands that I'm missing?
I haven't seen any hands yet.
Okay, and no further comments.
No further hands, yeah. So we should say going once for comments, twice. Yeah, okay.
Great.
I think
Okay, oh, sorry.
COVID-19 does.
So the next slide is just a bit of a confidence level polling question that we have. So Farko, will you be able to bring that poll up for us? So we're heading into, I think this was one of the questions, not specifically related to TCFD, but just questions around dealing with kind of climate risk and opportunities. So this next section, we're heading into that, and it'll specifically focus around some of the TCFD recommendations. So the question is, how confident would you feel in engaging in a discussion on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure? Seems most at this stage are feeling not too confident, with another saying not confident at all. Well, then you're certainly attending the right workshops. Oh, it seems it's changed now. More people saying that they are fairly confident. So Siren, I think when we get to the recommendations, that just the general ones, we can probably go over a bit quicker and stand a bit more still. Okay. It says that it's failed to share the poll. But yeah, so the outcomes of it was that most people do feel confident, and yeah, so Siren, I think that section we can pause a bit more on the asset management specific recommendations. So yeah, let's quickly head into what this means for investment decision making and how that would affect asset managers. Just before we head into that, so we've looked at climate change that Siren presented earlier on, and we've had the video, and obviously being asset managers, you guys have sort of a dual role as users of that information, of climate risk information that's being disclosed, as well as some using it to report on themselves. So I'm just going to run quickly through some of the kind of basic ideas around the need for climate related disclosure. So yeah, and what's been driving this urgent need around reporters needing to have to up their game. So we've seen locally and globally that reporters as well as investors, like Mila mentioned, have seen a surge in requests around broader ESG matters, and that's been an increase, and that's led to an increasing realization that there's a need for improved climate-related disclosure, which is not only important for better decision-making and managing risk at both a micro and macro scale, but it also helps companies as well as financial institutions and governments to understand their risks, which includes both physical and transition risk as exposed by climate change, and to strategically plan for the transition to a low carbon economy. So yeah, and I think that kind of just made more individuals realize, and companies, that having access to this data and reporting to this data on this data is not only useful to corporates or investors, but there's a variety of stakeholders that actually stand to benefit and being better off at the end of the day if they are able to get their hands on decision useful information. And that includes, some of them I've mentioned, governments and some NGOs and various other social and civil organizations are also able to draw on information relating to that. Then before we head into the section, I just want to add another poll here. If Safako can bring this up for us, just a question around which climate-related disclosure framework you are most familiar with. We're going to touch in a few slides coming up just around CDP and TCFD and what the link is, and just have a quick look at some of the frameworks that's been used up to date, and what the similarities are between the two. So it does seem at this stage as if a lot of the participants in today's session do have a good understanding of TCFD as well as CDP, GRI less so, and then science-based targets. SERIN, it seems people are also a bit, or not a bit, very unfamiliar with at this stage, which is great to hear, because SERIN is going to do a session on science-based targets, and the metrics and targets section, SERIN as well as Brett will be tackling a little bit later. Okay, so we can quickly just flip to the next slide. So yeah, we know that we are in need of credible and timeless, relevant climate-related disclosures, and yeah, so these are a few of the most notable frameworks that are generally used to report climate data on, and we'll more extensively discuss the TCFD recommendations today with you guys. But I also just want to quickly touch on CDP, because South Africa does have a long history, or South African corporates has a long history of reporting on CDP, and we'll chat about it a bit later in more detail. But what we've seen in some of the research is that existing CDP reporting among South African reporters have set some of the reporters up to more easily be able to transition to TCFD aligned reporting, because you'll notice as we go through the TCFD recommendations that it does touch on similar themes such as governance and targets and emissions and so forth, which is also covered by the TCFD framework. So yeah, like I mentioned, there's various links between those two frameworks, and that has set up corporates well to be able to make that easy transition. And then I'd like to quickly just run through and unpack some of the risks, opportunities, and then the financial implications a bit more, because I think that's, given that we've looked at climate change and what that means for us as a society, and a world that it makes sense to just unpack some of these risks and opportunities, and kind of getting a feel of how one can start thinking about, as organizations, about how to leverage off some of these opportunities that might come or be born out of some of these risks. So yeah, there's 4 broad categories: policy and legal risks, technology risk, market risk, and then reputation risk. So the policy and legal risk, that relates to where there's certain kind of what's the correct word? Almost a fallout or result from changes in policy, such as carbon pricing, implementing carbon pricing mechanisms to reduce GHG emissions, and adopting energy efficiency solutions, and encouraging water efficiency and so forth. So from a policy perspective, that opens up a whole kind of host of risks. And then on the legal side, for property owners and municipalities and various other kind of legal entities, I would say, there's recently, globally, and been an uptick in some of these climate-related litigation claims that's been brought forward because certain organizations have failed to consider climate change as part of their risk, and then basically failing in some of their fiduciary duties that they needed to take care of. And then we've seen increase in litigation around some of those damages that has resulted as climate change has intensified. So I've mentioned earlier some of these efficiencies and so forth. So with the technology risk, there's been significant technology improvements and innovations that have been able to support this transition to a lower carbon economy, and energy efficient economic systems could potentially have big impacts for certain organizations, where these organizations, the development and the use of energy efficiency and carbon capture and storage, for example, will affect ultimately certain organizations' competitiveness within industries, and their ability to produce and distribute and so forth. So yeah, I mean, from that perspective, there'll certainly be some winners and losers if they're not able to kind of effectively and quickly enough adapt to these various changes that are brought on as a result of these new technological innovations. So from a market risk perspective, while there are ways in which markets could be affected by climate change, we know that it's varied and also very complex. And one of the major ways is through shifts in supply and demand for certain commodities, products and services, as well as climate-related risks and opportunities are increasingly being taken into account by various stakeholders. And again, that will result in some winners and losers in this transition that we're going through. And yeah, then lastly, and I think this is probably top of mind for a lot of organizations, is the reputation risk that's related to the consequences of not adapting and not addressing climate change as an organization. And that's linked to things like customer and community perceptions around how organizations are contributing or detracting from this transition. So, like I've mentioned, climate-related risks are certainly real, but with all big transitions, there's also upsides to it, and a lot of good opportunities organizations can leverage off if they position themselves well early enough. So the resource efficiency that I've mentioned on the risk side, but that basically just relates to reducing things like costs and operating expenses and so on by using various technologies that are able to reduce things like a company's energy use or water use. So that's one of the big, I think, advantages that'll come from this transition is companies and various other stakeholders will probably be able to reduce their efficiencies on different levels, depending on how deeply integrated these technologies are within their organizations. Yeah, and then technology has certainly, and we've seen this, I think, in South Africa, there's been some great shifts recently around just the use of renewable energies, and it's the innovations around that in that field has resulted in great changes being made around how we procure our energy and generate energy. And I think this will probably continue, and we'll see an uptick in that space over the next few months, especially given that we've recently seen legislation being adjusted favorably for organizations to be able to produce their own energy. Then products and services, like I mentioned, this is an area where organizations certainly are able to leverage off well if they have certain services and products that are able to reduce things like carbon footprint and really just improve their competitive advantage by providing new and innovative products and services that relate to lowering emissions. So markets, organizations that are going to proactively seek opportunities in new markets or different types of assets will be able to diversify their activities and better position themselves for the transition to a lower carbon economy. And then just lastly, some of the other opportunities relate to the concept of climate-related resilience that relates to organizations being able to developing an adaptive capacity to respond to climate change, to better be able to manage those associated risks that I've mentioned, and also seize on the opportunities which we've just discussed, including the ability to respond to various transition risks and physical risks as well. And then I'd just like to quickly pause and show this image. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail, but essentially the TCFD has provided a nice kind of overview around in which pockets these opportunities and various transition risks and physical risk then at the end of the day on a company has financial impact, and which components of their financial basis is then impacted. I'm not going to kind of unpack this too much, but I mean, surely as organizations that operate or participants that operate in the investment industry, this image should kind of be something that's quite scary to see, the various impacts this could potentially have on various different organizations. So yeah, that wraps up just the risks, opportunities, and the potential financial impacts of climate change. I do see a few comments in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. Seren, you can quickly load it onto yours because you're presenting now for us on the recommendations. And then I'll quickly just head into see if I can comment on some of these questions. I'll redirect if need be.
Thanks, Melanie. Just checking if you can see my screen all right.
Yes, we can. I'll say there's your presentation mode. Seren, I think you can start. I'll answer or try and answer in the chat box, or we can take some of this over into the Q&A session later on.
Sure, perfect. All right, hi everyone, it's me again. We're going into the next part of today's agenda, which is diving into the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendations and the 11 sub-recommendations with specific guidance for asset managers. But before we jump in, let's quickly do a poll to check if you're with us and make sure that the blood is pumping to the brain. We've got a little poll for you today around which of the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework are you or your organization least comfortable with. So metrics and targets and governance is coming up. And we've done similar webinars previously as part of this project, and metrics and targets was another one that came up as quite strongly as a place where people needed some support. When we see there are some responses across all 4 of the pillars, just going to give it another 15, 20 seconds to give those last couple of people a chance to respond. Yeah, but we can see that, metrics and targets seem to be the one area of TCFD where people are struggling a bit. And it's common. I think that's what we've been finding across the different webinars and engagements we've been having. Governance and strategy, there are also a couple of people that are interested in learning more about those. So hopefully over the next session, we can, just help you familiarize yourself with these, with the ones you're struggling, as well as just re-engage you on all 4 of the pillars, as well as some recommendations for asset managers. The Global Financial Stability Board, they established a task force to develop recommendations for effective climate-related disclosures that can support all financial services, which include investments, but also includes credit and underwriting ability, to help them better understand their climate risk and make sure that it's being integrated within the operations. So although the FSP and TCFD is committed to disclosures and market transparency, the TCFD framework is more than that. The recommendations are more than just another tick box exercise or a climate reporting framework. They are meant to be a tool to help investors understand their companies, understand their own individual operations, understand climate risks, and the framework is meant to provide guidance on how to manage those risks. So it's not a compliance thing where it might be becoming a mandatory regulatory requirement. I think there was a comment in the chat about mandatory disclosure on the TCFD. It's not a compliance thing in the sense that it's meant for asset managers, people in the financial sector, as a tool to really help them to ask themselves reflective questions so that they can answer it for themselves. and take their business from A to B in terms of integrating climate-related risks. So the recommendations that came out of the TCFD were centered around 4 thematic areas, as kind of mentioned, alluding to this session, and these are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Now, the TCFD has recommendations for the financial sector, but it's also got recommendations for non-financial sector actors. And it's got specific recommendations in certain areas that relate to asset managers and what they should be thinking about and what they should be looking to disclose. So with that said, here's the 4 pillars, and under each of the 4 pillars, there's recommended disclosures beneath that, and there's guidance on what exactly to disclose beneath those pillars and beneath those recommendations. And we're going to go through that in a second now, and I just want to remind people that although this slide here and the next part of today's session is going to be a bit text heavy, we are going to share the slides with you after this, and all the resources from where we got this information source, or a lot of the slides, a lot of the content you see in the slides, those sources will be sent to you and shared with you as well. So if you're struggling to read a bit or you find it a bit overwhelming, just take a breath and realize, you're going to get these slides afterward, and there's plenty of resources in which you can access to get a glimpse of these when you've got more time or more bandwidth to kind of delve deeper into them, or perhaps there's one specific one that you're struggling with, and that's the one you want to look at, and you can go straight into the metrics and targets recommendations, for example, and look at what the TCFD is saying there. But for today, I will be going through these pillars, and we'll kind of go through this a bit quicker than we normally would, because we kind of want to focus on more of the asset manager side, and we did chat to a lot of these things previously. So the first slide shows an overview of the governance pillar of TCFD. The recommendation under governance is for companies to disclose the organizations around climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first part is talking about the role that the board plays in managing climate change, the board of the company, what's the process that they use, how do they monitor and evaluate climate risk management within the organization. The second part of the governance theme is about describing management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risk and opportunity. What are the processes? What are the committees? How does climate risk management work within the organization? And how does that feed up into the board and into the decision-making process? Which of the senior management or executive managers are involved in these processes in the different communities? So describing how that works. But for asset managers, the recommendations of the TCFD is advising that asset managers who act as fiduciaries, so they take their clients' interests at heart and put that first. Asset managers have a responsibility to disclose to their clients through different reporting or different communication methods about how they are internally managing climate-related risks for either that specific portfolio or fund or for the organization as a whole. On to the next pillar, which is the strategy pillar. The strategy pillar asking companies to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. Now, there are 3 levels of guidance on disclosing strategy-related climate-related disclosures. Firstly, it's about describing the climate-related risk and opportunities over the short, medium, and long term, describing what the organization considers relevant risks, how these manifest, as well as a description around these time horizons. If it's possible, organizations should also provide a description of the risk and opportunities by sector or geography. And as sector and geographic specific data and information is really critical in understanding climate change risks. And this is a great point for asset managers as well, because sector exposure is a key part of, asset allocation, diversification within the fund, the specific theme of the fund, the specific strategy of the fund will have certain components around sector, and thinking about how your sector exposures and climate change risks are related is a fundamental aspect of managing your climate change and climate related risk exposure. The same is true for geographic risks. As we showed earlier on a previous slide, different countries have different policies, different levels of carbon taxes, different countries are more exposed to the energy sector than others. All these things need to form a way, or climate change risk management needs to form part of this to enable your overall strategy around asset management in the details for each specific organization. So it's good questions to ask and nice guidance from TCFD here. The second part around strategy is around describing the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the business strategy and financial planning. So how has and how could climate change impact materialize and have an impact on the products and services, the investee companies or the companies part of the value chain? And this also is important for looking at the potential impacts on operating costs, revenues, capital expenditures. Climate scenarios is also something that is important in TCFD, and disclosures around how access to capital would change under different scenarios is also an important consideration, because access to capital would be constrained under a particular scenario, and therefore that could impact future business scenarios. Scenarios and forecasting and future-looking statements is an important part of investment management and fund management, portfolio management, looking at companies, looking at if you're an investment analyst out there looking at specific companies, how do the forecasts of your companies that you invest in, their products, services, the impacts on their supply chain, the operating costs, revenues, how is all that going to change in different scenarios? Important considerations for asset managers when looking to value stocks or looking to pick certain companies. Some supplemental guidance from TCFD here is around asset managers and how they engage or how they factor in climate-related risk and opportunity into their relevant strategies. Asset managers should describe how each product or investment strategy might be affected by the transition to a lower carbon economy. Looking internally and asking yourselves these questions about, okay, is climate change going to impact this fund or this product from a transition risk or even from a physical risk perspective? The third component of the strategy pillar is looking again at scenario analysis, which is an important tool for fund managers. The big advantage of scenarios is that they're forward-looking. As a risk management tool, scenario analysis is already quite popular among financial services companies, for example, around capital management or adequacy or solvency and stress tests, critical components for financial risk management. And climate change could be an important factor into those scenarios. So the TCFD recommends that companies look at the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into considerations different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So we would encourage, of course, looking at 1.5-degree scenarios, but I think the world is on track for what could be 3 to 4, so urgent action is needed. I think we're going to talk more about that later today in the session, and we're also having future training sessions as part of this overall project, which is going to be hosted by our project partners, that will go more deeper into discussing how to use scenario analysis. But here, my main aim is to just highlight that TCFD is talking about scenarios and encouraging companies and asset managers to include different scenarios when looking at their strategies. On to the third pillar now, which is about risk management. This pillar is about disclosing how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risk. Yeah, yes. So the first part of the risk management guidance is about describing how the organization decides on the significance of the chosen climate-related risks, and if possible, in relation to how other risks are identified, including in this is making sure that people describe the definitions or terminologies that they use within their process. A big part of TCFD has been on transition risks. So organizations should also describe if they see any regulatory changes that could impact their business, which is something we've highlighted a few times today. Look at the guidance for asset management in terms of risk management. Here we can think about active ownership. Active asset managers should describe the way they engage with investing companies, as well as how they determine material climate-related risks. I think engagement with companies by asset managers and portfolio managers, investment analysts is quite common. Proxy voting is one example that comes across as good governance, but it's also part of broader ESG and sustainability trends, and has been something that many factions have been pushing for greater engagement by asset managers with regard to proxy voting for a number of years now. Specifically for us here today, with regards to climate-related risks, asset managers should engage with their portfolio companies on areas where they see gaps or needs for improvement. For example, under GHG disclosures or under third-party assurances or governance issues that asset managers might identify. Engagement is encouraged by TCFD and is one of the factors of risk management that TCFD recommendation is guiding asset managers on. The next part of the risk management theme is also on processes for identifying climate risks. But here it's important to focus on the decisions made to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control risks. In the financial sector, risk mitigation and financial risk management is a core practice. So this is leaning towards that. And asset managers should describe how they manage material risks for each product or investment strategy. And I think this has come up before on a previous slide, as indicated previously on another pillar, but it's important to consider this as risk management under the risk management pillar as well. The last element on risk management is about how the organizations integrate the climate-related risk management process within the organization's overall risk management process, ERP or ERMs, or however the organization is structured. They've got the existing risk management processes, and how is this part of that? How is this integrated to that is an important question to ask yourselves and eventually hopefully disclose. Onto the last pillar, which I think is the one that many people here today were having a bit of trouble on. This is the theme about metrics and targets. So it's recommended that organizations should disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risk and opportunities. So the first part of this pillar is about asking a few key questions like what are the key metrics used by the organizations, as well as the definitions and methodologies used to calculate those metrics. Are there other metrics used like those around water, energy, land use, waste management that need to be disclosed that are related to this? And how do these most material metrics impact on the remuneration of executive management, senior management, if at all? And can historical data of metrics either be disclosed or used for a trend analysis? Then on to the supplemental guidance for asset managers as part of the metrics and targets pillar. So asset managers should describe the metrics used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in each of the products or investment strategies that they have. Where relevant, asset managers should also describe how these metrics have changed over time, and asset managers should provide metrics considered in investment decisions and monitoring. So are you using sector allocations? Are you using carbon footprinting, which we'll talk about in a second? Are you using, maybe you're adding additional risk premium or discount factor to your valuations of companies. Those kinds of interesting things are important for clients to see, but also for asset managers themselves to think about in future for how they actually integrate climate-related risk management within their business. The next part of the metrics and targets pillar is referring to scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. We did speak about this earlier in the session. It's come up again as mentioned. Organizations should disclose scope 1, 2, and where appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, as well as any adopted efficiency ratios. Where possible, historical data for trend analysis should also be provided, and the greenhouse gas protocol is widely recommended as a great methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions and doing calculations, and organizations are encouraged to use it. I do think that most people use the greenhouse gas reporting protocol. There are others out there, and I think we're moving in terms of harmonization towards GHG protocol versus maybe other definitions. But if another definition is used, then that should be disclosed and motivated as to why that specific protocol or definition methodology was used. In terms of guidance for asset managers under the second part of the metrics and targets pillar, asset managers should provide the weighted average carbon intensity where available or can be reasonably estimated for each fund or each portfolio or each investment strategy. In addition, asset managers should look at other potential metrics that they might believe that's useful for decision making. Common carbon metrics that get disclosed are weighted average carbon intensity, and we've spoken about what the definitions are for greenhouse gases. We've spoken about the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what people use to kind of measure and then disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. Weighted average carbon intensity is looking at what is your ownership position in that company. That could be as a percentage of the market cap of shares or percentage of enterprise value, and then looking at what is the carbon footprint of that company and multiplying that together and summing it up, and then you would get what your portfolio average carbon emissions are. When it comes to intensity, carbon intensity refers to your greenhouse gas emissions divided by your revenue. So how many tons do you emit per million rand in revenue? To get that at a portfolio level, you take the weight of each company's carbon intensity, and then you sum that up to get your weighted average carbon intensity for a portfolio. And then there's lots of different ways to kind of dissect carbon emissions in the portfolio, but these are the common ones, and it's important that companies and asset managers consider this in their risk management processes or in their fund management and investment decision-making processes. But there are other metrics that one can consider that we don't have time to always go into here, but these are some of the more common ones that one can use as a metric for tracking your carbon footprint over time, for targeting what your level of intensity what you want to be year by year by year. And eventually you want to get that total carbon emissions down to net zero, carbon intensity down to net zero. So these are important metrics to kind of look at for asset managers in terms of that race to net zero. That so many of us have been talking about. Onto the last pillar, onto the last part of the last pillar. So what is becoming a bit newer and increasingly topical is the setting of targets. Organizations are encouraged to set targets and describe these targets that are set, as well as disclose the performance against those targets. So in describing these targets, organizations should consider whether the targets are absolute or intensity-based. And we spoke about some of them in the previous slide. And these can be the GHG tons of CO2 or carbon intensity, which is GHG tons per million rand in revenues. And then critical to these targets is the timeframes and base years. and then disclosing the key performance indicators used to assess progress against these targets. We're going to chat more about metrics and targets in the upcoming session. We're going to chat more about SBTIs and how Science-Based Target Initiative can help companies in setting their targets. But yeah, this was the overview of the recommendations of the TCFD, each of the pillars, each of the recommendations under those pillars, and a bit of supplemental guidance for asset managers, which is our main audience, target audience for today. So yes, it's been a bit of a content-heavy situation. Hopefully you managed to absorb as much of that as you can. Please ask any questions in the chat. Please put any thoughts or comments in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. This is a workshop, so we want to encourage engagement at all points in time. But with that, I think we've come to the end of the TCFD pillar part of today's agenda, and we'd like to round off with a bit of a question. So, has your organization become a formal TCFD supporter, and are you actively considering taking up the recommendations? So the poll should come up on your screen now. So we'd love to hear what you've been thinking. Seems we've got very low participation on this poll. Hopefully we didn't lose too many people over the very content-heavy part of today. We've got some fantastic stuff coming up. But it seems so far from the poll that most people have not yet taken it up, while a couple of people are formal supporters. One is a formal supporter, while the other is actively considering taking up the recommendations.
Siren?
Yes.
We do have 3 individuals responding in the comment section saying that they would have loved to see a not applicable option in the voting. Apologies for that, but thanks for noting in the chat box. Appreciated.
Thanks, Milani. Yes, not applicable. Well, hopefully after today's session, we'll move you to the actively considering bunch, and from those who are actively considering, we'll move you towards close towards becoming formal supporters. Thanks for those who have responded to the poll. There's another poll coming up, so we want to keep you on your toes here if you're paying attention. Which of the following are not one of the 4 pillars of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures? Is it A, metrics and targets, B, strategy, C, HR management, D, governance, or E, risk management? Yeah, this is an easy one. All of you should get this right. We're seeing some results coming in. Yeah. Yeah, most people say HR management. And yeah, that's correct. No cheating. I'm sure some people saw the responses and it's just like, oh yeah, that must be the answer. But that's an easy question, so you should have got that one right. Thanks everyone who participated in the polls. I think that's going to be the end of my session. Molani, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Siren. I am just cognizant of the time. We are running slightly behind our scheduled time. We were set to have a tea break, a longer one, at 20 to 12. It's already 12 o'clock. I wonder if, just by show of hands, because this was a bit of a long session, if people would like to take a comfort break, but just 10 minutes this time, and then we can start with the individual exercise that'll look at what climate data should be disclosed at 10 past 12. Is everyone okay with that? See a hand from Adrian, Siren, Anisha. Okay, seems everyone's happy, or a lot of people. I have one hand up. I'm not sure. Let me just see. Apologies, I seem to am struggling to
Rani,
find
that's
Kerry.
Kerry has raised her hand. So Kerry, if you
you're
want...
welcome to unmute your mic.
I'm so sorry. My hand was raised in order to indicate I was fine. ma'am. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let's take a quick 10-minute comfort break. We're back at 12:10 and we'll get into the individual exercise. Great, see you guys soon. Hi, everyone. So it's 12:10. If I can just ask those that are present at this stage to give a thumbs up. I'm going to start setting up the screen on my end. 3 people. 5, 6. Okay. I'll give it another minute or so. Great. So I'll share the screen on my end quickly. So what the planning is now is to do a bit of an individual exercise, given all of the information that Seren just shared in his session around what the guidance is that companies should be disclosing, as well as asset managers. We're going to do a bit of an exercise. I'm not going to, or we can spend a bit more time on this. I think the next session on the trends and data, I can go over a bit quicker because I'm mindful that people have a bigger need to get to the metrics, targets, and scenarios. So for this session, what we thought we'd like to do was use some of the fact sheets as a guide, just because in terms of time, it's a bit laboursome to go have you guys asked to go and have a look at a company's actual report. But yeah, to use some of these fact sheets, Seren or Safaku, if you guys can maybe just copy that link for us into the chat box. You can go and have a look at that link and pick maybe there's a interesting investee company that you'd like to take a look at. So what we did there was set up some of these fact sheets to give people an idea of what climate-related data as kind of structured around the TCFD pillars are currently being disclosed. As we, I think Mila mentioned earlier, we've seen a good uptick in recent months, and I'm sure this data that we've compiled was done earlier in this year, and I'm sure in the recent months there's probably even better information available. But you can take a look at these sheets that are available, open whichever company you prefer looking at, and have a look at what they're currently disclosing versus what the TCFD recommendations would like to see be disclosed. And then I've created another slide on that Jamboard, and you guys can use the Jamboard or even the chat function, or you're welcome to unmute yourself, put on your video and kind of have a good old chat about it. But yeah, to make some notes about what information you're seeing are being disclosed and what other information there's not being disclosed, but the TCFD recommendations recommend companies do disclose. Yeah, so I'll give people, we're now almost 12:15. Let's give people around 10 minutes or so. So at 25:12, you're welcome to kind of reconvene, but like I said, you're also very welcome to unmute yourself and chat. Seren, if I could maybe ask you to just keep an eye out on that Jamboard. I added a third slide and a note around data being disclosed. So maybe you can manage or kind of have a look at that, see what's coming in and what notes are being made there while people are busy.
Sure, we'll do. Nothing so far. Jamboard.
Okay, I see we have a question around assistance where to find the fact sheets. So Faku, can you maybe assist in GWare on that? Thanks, Adrian. I see you sent another link. Maybe just to also add while you guys are looking at the sheets. So these sheets were compiled based off of publicly available information, and then also a lot of information based off of the company's CDP reports. We've, yeah, like I mentioned earlier in this session, a lot of South African corporates already using CDP to report, and the CDP questionnaire is quite extensive. Siren, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it is it 29 questions that are addressing some of the requirements that's stipulated in that TCFD framework. I believe I saw it in one of our slides. Yeah, so a lot of publicly available information that was used to inform some of these, or the compilation of these sheets. Adrian, maybe you can speak to this. I see Mila made a comment in the chat box saying that these fact sheets are very useful. Thank you, Mila. It's great to hear that yeah, you guys find it a useful tool. And then, or maybe Bianca, I'm not sure if you can comment on this, if the intention is to broaden the coverage beyond the top 50. I mean, yeah, like you guys would see, it's top 50 only at this stage. I know there are subsequent phases, Adrian, that could potentially form part of this bigger project. So I'm not sure if you're able to speak to that.
Yeah, Mel, at this stage, in terms of the existing phase 1 of this UK Pact project, you know, the budget only allowed for, you know, the 50, and we had to prioritize these, but we are in discussions and exploring ways to expand the scope of this current project into subsequent years. We're also wanting to expand the coverage beyond the listed equity asset class. So looking at fixed income or unlisted investments as well. So for now, I'm afraid it's limited to the 54 or 55 fact sheets. But you know, again, we'd welcome constructive feedback on how we can improve them. And you know, we're glad that you know, it seems that folk do see value in them.
I also see Kent mentioning that he's noticing some key emitting sectors not being present, like cement. Kent, I believe that would probably have to be related to the size of the company when we were looking at the top 50 at that stage. Things might have changed, you know, on that list during this year, but at that stage, we didn't have any of those sectors, and we're mindful of the fact that, you know, there are some big entities that people would like to see, but unfortunately, yeah, the scope of this project, like Adrian mentioned, is at this stage listed assets, and then we'd like to expand in future. We're very mindful of some of those big emitters. Now, Siren, would you want to add anything?
Yeah. On the cement, the big one is PPC, but they don't form part of the top 40 or top 50. So that's why they unfortunately ended up being excluded. There is work done on sustainable cement. I'm gonna just find a link for you if you're interested. So yeah, that's unfortunate that, you know, PPC fell out of the scope, but that's just because of the size factor. Which other sectors, Kent, are you looking for that you feel is missing? We appreciate the feedback, you know, and if we do expand, we'll factor that into the, you know, revised scope of companies to look at and sectors to look at. And Melanie, nothing coming through on the Jamboard yet.
Okay, all right. Well, let's give folks a few minutes. I think there's 1 more minute left. But I mean, yeah, we can also just have a nice discussion about it on audio. People can unmute themselves if they're not keen to use the Jamboard.
And just to respond quick, I didn't have a good look at all the sectors, but from my perspective, I was just checking some of the big emitting sectors. So I just wait for now, but yeah, so maybe just an idea just to look at representation of some of the big emitters as well as the financial revenue perspective.
Thanks for that, Kent. We'll definitely keep it in mind if we're able to get further funding to expand the scope. I mean, yeah, like I mentioned, there's been questions from some of the advisory and Steercom guys as well around companies they would have liked to see in here that's not necessarily listed assets or fall under the listed assets at this stage. That are super important to be able to factor in, and unfortunately, under scope of this project, we're not able to do so. Okay, so Siren, are we getting any feedback at this stage on the Jamboard? Alternatively, yeah, I think we can open the floor. People welcome to unmute themselves. Just if you could share your thoughts around info that's currently being disclosed, what you're seeing, even if it's just comments on the fact sheets themselves, and if there's ways you think we can improve, or just a general feel about what the information is that's being disclosed at this stage.
On the Jamboard yet, Melanie? So we saw anyone's free to open their mic and respond with a question or comment.
Okay, so we've seen
I do see one. Oh, sorry, Melanie. There's been a comment on the Jamboard. Yeah, it says the specific risks and opportunities identified would be helpful to include in the fact sheets if it is reported. So that's a comment there on the Jamboard. I did have another comment around or question around the clarity around how we use the word impact. So we've referred to impact in the presentation and as well as in fact sheets, and you know, the impact versus kind of outputs. So whereas outputs can be measured on a yearly basis, where impacts take a bit more time to actually materialize. So yeah, I think the way we've been using impact is the impact that climate risk would have on the business, which would be, probably longer term in materializing, but could, extreme weather events could happen at any time. But you're right in terms of outputs of what an individual company is doing to manage those risks. That would be more of interest in our purposes for disclosure purposes. So that's within, monitoring and evaluation. What are the things that the company has done to mitigate the risks? And then the impact, the thing about climate change impacts is that, or mitigation impacts, is that if nothing happens, that's actually a good thing. So, the impact that you've mitigated, the risk that you've mitigated would be, to have a zero impact. But it's, again, also important to understand the terminologies, definitions used within each and every company, which is kind of nuanced. Although, these words might have one meaning for myself, it might have another meaning for you, it might have another meaning for another company. So it's important to kind of disclose the terminologies and definitions that you use up front. Yeah.
Thanks, Siren. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think our objective was to look at what's being disclosed, so and to be able to relay that. But like you've rightly mentioned, those terminologies would be specific to that company that's using it. What was the other question around?
The other question was around this listing the specific opportunities that provide.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So as a team, I think we really struggled with that because you get reports that are quite extensive, and to list all of those opportunities and risks, I mean, that's quite tricky to do if you're compiling a fact sheet, which should really only kind of contain the essence. So we try to merely at those points identify if companies are disclosing that or not, and hence we've made detailed, you'll see throughout the fact sheets, there's detailed reference as well as links in the fact sheets to those specific reports we've used to extract the data, and you're able to then use those to guide you to where that information sits, because sometimes it runs over multiple pages within a report. I mean, your resource intensive organizations or mining industries, they have a long legacy of having to report on those type of environmental risks. So you typically get reports that are quite extensive, and that makes it very challenging to summarize in one fact sheet. So unfortunately, it was also kind of limited to space and what we were able to do at that stage with the big amounts of information we had to work through. Okay, so maybe I can ask a question to our audience. I mean, I think it's coming up in the polling question, Safaku, but we can probably skip that polling question. I'll use it to maybe gauge the audience's feeling around that. But from your personal opinion, do you think the information that I see we have a hand, Tinjiwe?
Hi, good morning, Melanie. How are you?
Hi. You're welcome to ask a question or comment.
Sorry, I just asked. I see you use the JSE top 50 to select the companies. So I just wanted to find out how often do you review that? Like, how does your system work?
Yeah, so unfortunately, due to the scope of the project, this was a once-off exercise. So I think, if I recall correctly, the list was drawn around February or March, and yeah, at this stage, it's not been updated yet. But like we said, if there's scope to expand and update some of these, it'll be great, because there are companies that have made major strides in the last few months, just in terms of what they are able to report. We've seen some good uptick there from corporate reporters. So yeah, that's unfortunately the nature of what we're dealing with in terms of keeping this up to date at this stage.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just getting back to a question that I had was just around how useful you guys, yeah, I mean, this can be your own personal view. It doesn't need to kind of represent your organization as a whole. But if you guys would like to share some thoughts around what you feel the level of disclosure around climate-related matters are at this stage, and if what's being disclosed is really useful, and maybe if there's additional information that you feel you'd like to see that you're not seeing at this stage. I see we have a comment in the chat box. Oh, Adrian, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so no additional comments. So I'm going to do a Siren, going once, going twice. Then we can head into, I'm going to skip this poll, Safaka, and then we can head into the data and trends. What I'm going to do, I'm mindful of time because we have the metrics and scenarios and targets that's coming up. And I know people are eager to learn a bit more, and we have Professor Brett that's going to also present with Siren on that. So that's coming up in 20-25 minutes. So what I think I'm going to do is there's a few intro slides on this that's just giving you guys a bit of an overview around what the global uptake is around things like the TCFD and what the latest kind of status is on that, what they're seeing globally around what companies are disclosing, what pillars they're using most, and so forth. But I think what I'll do is first skip over this because this is a bit also text heavy, and you guys will have access to the slides if you guys don't mind. And then maybe what we could do, which might be more interesting to you guys, is just have a chat about some of the research related to this fact sheets work that we've done, and then our earlier work that we did together with WWF that was Sanlam funded. Thanks, Kent. I see, note your comment that they're helpful. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, maybe let's just have a quick discussion. We did a research project together with WWF towards the end of this year, which we did a nice webinar on very early in this year around the emerging importance of the TCFD framework for South African companies and investors. Siren or Safaka, you're welcome to share that link in the chat box so that people are able to access the full report, because these are merely snapshots of what we did. But we undertook the research with the objective of getting a better understanding of what the status is of the uptake of TCFD within South Africa, particularly amongst companies and investors. And we had engagements with various stakeholder representatives from both listed companies and investors, which included asset managers, retirement funds, various industry bodies, and private equity investors and the likes. So in these engagements, several aspects of the framework were discussed, including the level of knowledge and awareness and the value of the framework, and the processes of adopting, if they were at that stage adopting it, and some of the successes and challenges that they might have faced. So I think broadly speaking, although a lot of progress has been made by investors and reporters in recent years, like I mentioned, we've seen reporters really leading the pack, and it's clear that there's still some work to be done amongst the investor community. Although, like Mila mentioned, there's been good progress there, and that's particularly true for aspects that relate to the more quantitative sides of calculating climate risk. That's probably where the most work is needed at this stage. And then just generally speaking, South African reporters have made good progress on the more, if you want to call it, qualitative pillars. So your governance and strategy, some aspects of that, because like I mentioned earlier, the CDP reporting that they would have historically done would have touched on some of those aspects. So to quickly run over through some of the most recent work we've done, which formed part of this project. Six Capitals and WWF analyzed the climate reporting or the disclosure of the top 50, and yeah, we looked at that against against the 4 pillars as well as the recommendations of the TCFD framework. And I think what was good for us to see was that although local reporters are lagging behind their international counterparts in disclosing their climate risk exposure, it was encouraging to see that South African reporters did perform moderately well in terms of climate financial disclosure. So, I mean, yeah, like I said, we have a good legacy in South Africa of being good reporters, and that's mainly been driven by things such as the CDP. Yeah, and then the analysis further confirmed that climate-related disclosure are much more widespread than we would have expected based off of the number of formal reporters that we're seeing out of South Africa supporting the TCFD framework, and that current reporting has been driven by things such as existing climate practices through CDP, playing a leading role there. So around 2/3 of the companies that we looked at did report against CDP. I think it's important to also just note on that, like I mentioned, the data that we looked at was based off of publicly available information, although your CDP reports, there are companies that put it on their website and include it in their annual reports and so forth. But the process we went through was to go and draw those CDP reports and take an individual look at those reports based off of what they reported to the CDP. So yeah, we also assessed whether companies report against CDP, and yeah, that was then used to further inform some of the findings. So if we take a quick look at just in terms of the formal and informal supporters, we find that although there are few formal South African supporters that do support the TCFD framework, and those you'll see mainly sit within organizations that are related to industry associations and regulators. We also, and a lot of companies naturally that do have those dual listings that are further progressed on that journey. We also saw, interestingly enough, that you have almost what you can call informal supporters. So there's companies that have disclosed that they are in the process of aligning their disclosure to the TCFD framework, but don't formally mention that they support the framework. But you can, if you compare their reporting and the themes that they cover, you can see there's alignment between those themes that are covered, as well as the themes that are covered among the TCFD framework. And yeah, then I had a look earlier, or towards the middle of August. Initially, there were 13 listed companies from South Africa in Q1, and then those figures subsequently increased a bit to 18 formal supporters more recently, which is great news to see. I'm just checking my time here. So this was the initial list of organizations that we looked at that were formal supporters. that subsequently increased. There's a few additional organizations that came on board. I think an important one that we saw were the likes of Momentum more recently. Then I'm going to just end off on some of the barriers and some of the kind of findings that we saw around what stakeholders indicated were some of the almost positives from that's resulted as a result of the TCFD framework gaining so much prominence. So it does seem that, especially recently, the recommendations have proven to be a useful tool to understand as well as report on climate risk. And we've seen more recently, especially amongst some of the South African corporates, that there's a bigger move towards trying to quantify these risks, although I'm mindful of the fact that there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think the biggest traction there at this stage is probably amongst the banking industry, but there's various other industries that still need to go the route of quantifying these risks. Yeah, and then stakeholders have indicated that the framework have been beneficial and assisted both investors as well as companies to be able to identify their gaps and better understand some of their climate risks. Interestingly enough, we also had good feedback from some local asset managers indicating that using the framework itself to kind of structure conversations have been useful in engaging with investee companies around the framework and the themes to help them better understand their risks and influence companies to be able to adopt this framework at the end of the day. Yeah, and then just lastly, there's been some stakeholders have noted that it's great that they're seeing increased internal stakeholder buy-in, which is very important. I think someone mentioned or asked the question in the Jamboard around how reporting and scenarios and I think strategy can assist in basically kind of bringing climate reporting to the heart, or kind of change the core of an organization. And I think my response there is just that I think it's a bit more complex than merely using some of these to kind of change an organization at its core. I think it's really key for boards at the end of the day to have that buy-in at board level and to have that filter through the organization, because I think if you don't have that buy-in at the top where strategic decisions are made, it's very difficult to really drive change throughout the entire organization. And the other great thing that stakeholders noted were there's been improved comparable data. I'm saying this with severe caution because I know that's still an ongoing issue in ESG reporting, and there's still many discrepancies and it's difficult to compare some data sets on a like-for-like basis. But I think we are seeing an improved disclosure of data that one can compare, and it'll most likely, hopefully, improve as one sees an increased uptake, as well as potentially regulation around climate disclosure at the end of the day. Seren, I just want to pause there. Any questions at this stage that people have that we maybe need to ask before heading into the metrics and targets section?
Amel, there is a question in the chat from Mila. He asks, is it better than expected disclosure of CDP in South Africa a function of its being a requirement of being listed on JSE, or is it just good adoption by companies?
Siren, maybe you can answer that.
CDP is voluntary. I'm not sure if it's a requirement from JSE.
I don't think so.
Yeah, so CDP is a voluntary standard, but it's been adopted by many companies on the JSE. It's been one of the leading kind of disclosure platforms for a number of years. And the nice thing about CDP is that it gives you a score at the end of each reporting period. So you can, as a reporter, you can check your progress over time. As an investor, you can look at CDP and see the company's progress over time. And as an investor, it also gives you lots of access to really good information. So I think, the CDP is quite comprehensive, and people have been doing it for a number of years. So I think over time, they got better and better, and it helped them progress in terms of the information that they had, the processes that they implemented, and overall climate risk management. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Siren. I appreciate it. I'm just checking time, Adrian. Just remind me, did I say 10 to 1 is the kind of cutoff for this session formally?
Yeah, that's correct. I
Okay.
think we want to head into the metrics, targets, and scenario session.
Okay. So there's really only on my side one slide left, which I think people are able to kind of read through in their own. It's just some of the barriers that we've been able to kind of get throughout some of this research processes. And then maybe before we head into the metrics and targets and scenarios, another poll just to gauge your opinion around whose responsibility it is to disclose climate-related information, and with who does it primarily sit? Companies, investors, or both? So at this stage, many are aligned to the fact that both need to disclose. Very few thinking it's only companies' responsibilities. It's good to see that people are, in the same headspace around where the responsibility sits. I think it's important that, from an investor and a company's perspective, that both are able to disclose information that are useful, because as investors, there's various other stakeholders that then use your information that you report on at the end of the day to base their decisions off, as it relates to investments and so forth. Apologies for that. Great, so I am going to end my slideshow here and going to hand over to Siren and Brett. I think Brett is going to kick us off with a few slides.
That's right. Thanks very much, Mal. Let me just get my screen shared with everybody, and then I will dive into the metrics and scenarios. Mal, it seems like I've not got the opportunity to screen share, if you can allow me to do so.
Okay, I'll quickly change those permissions.
Thanks. Let me try now.
You should be able to now, Brent.
Okay, thank you very much. So this should be, thanks, Safaku. Okay, so if you can just confirm that you can see my full screen now, that would be great.
We can see your full screen.
Okay, that's good. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your very active participation so far. I've been enjoying seeing the engagement and the discussions that have been going on. So hopefully this session will add further into those discussions that we've been having. And I'm going to really be building on some of the elements that Seren has been talking to you about when he described to you the pillars of the TCFD. We wanted to present here a little bit more information on those, and also to give a couple of brief examples of what people are doing in terms of presenting metrics and targets. And then I'm going to briefly introduce you to a bit more detail about the scenarios. Although, as I will mention at the end of my session, we are going to be having a separate session on scenarios. It's a 3-hour session that will be dedicated to this topic. So for those of you that are interested in understanding the scenario pillar, you will be able to participate in that session. So we won't be spending too much time on it now. Now, the idea of metrics and targets is where I want to start. And if you remember this picture, which you saw earlier of the 4 pillars of the TCFD, you'll remember that metrics and targets represents the 4th pillar. And what the guidance or the framework suggests there is that people disclosing should disclose or encouraged to disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. And I think the last few words there are quite relevant, where such information is material. So there's not a need to disclose everything that is linked to climate risks and opportunities for organizations, but rather where that information is material. And then the guidance provides a little bit more information of what is expected here in terms of metrics and targets. So it breaks down the recommendations into 3 components. The first of these replicates what I said really on the previous slide, is to disclose the metrics used by the organization to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in line with the strategy and risk management process. So that's the first part of that recommendation, metrics to assess the climate risks and opportunities in line with the strategy and risk management process. There is a suggestion that one should include disclosure of Scope 1, Scope 2, and where relevant, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to just iterate what Seren has already mentioned to you around the difference between what is a Scope 1, a Scope 2, and a Scope 3 greenhouse gas emission, and of course the risks related to giving off those emissions. And then the third component, obviously, of metrics and targets focuses on the targets element. So that is to describe the targets used to manage climate-related risks and opportunities. And of course, you need to measure performance against those targets. And we'll talk about what are some of the targets that organizations might be setting, and particularly start to look at those that are relevant to asset managers. So just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of some of the terminology, a climate-related metric refers to any metric, a measurement that we talk about that links to an aspect of climate risks and opportunities. So we've spoken quite extensively through this course around physical risks. We've spoken about transition risks, and then of course the various opportunities that are available. So it's anything can be a measure of the link between those and between those risks and opportunities, but on a climate basis. Then the terminology on the right-hand side of the screen is really then translating that into what is the impact of those climate-related metrics. So the climate-related metrics might be something about like your greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And then the financial impact might be what is the tax that you might be paying on the emissions of those greenhouse gas emissions, or what could the impact be on capital included in a portfolio, for example, from a monetary perspective. So we measure the climate aspect, and then we measure the financial aspect. And then I think the term target is quite self-explanatory. That might be something around what are we doing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we measure something and then we have a target to try and reduce that or increase that particular metric. So just to talk a little bit more about this idea of greenhouse gas emissions, because reporting of greenhouse gas emissions is at the core of what is recommended by the TCFD, is that we report our scope 1 and our scope 2 and our scope 3 emissions. So what do these mean? And I know Serenus showed a slightly different picture of this a little bit earlier in the presentation. But scope 1 emissions are those emissions that occur directly within a reporting company's boundaries. And of course, there are ways in which we define boundaries. Sometimes it's what is owned by the company, sometimes what it's under operational control. But really, scope 1 is around any emissions from fuel that is burnt on site. Maybe a company is generating its own electricity or is burning fuel in generators or has vehicles that use fuel. So any of the emissions that might come from that organization directly are what are called scope 1 emissions. Another example here is in manufacturing processes. So Kent mentioned the cement industry earlier, and cement does give rise to a number of emissions just from the conversion of raw materials to final product, and those are counted as scope 1 emissions. Our scope 2 emissions, which is the sort of slightly grayer arrow on the left-hand side, are the emissions associated with the purchase of electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. So in South Africa, it's usually electricity that we purchase, but sometimes industries will buy steam or heating or cooling from their neighbors. And what it says is that although Eskom is generating your electricity, giving rise to the emissions on their side, in fact, the emissions associated with that consumed electricity should be allocated to the company using that electricity. So that is what's called your scope 2 emissions, your purchases of your electricity from Eskom. What do they mean in terms of emissions? And then the scope 3 emissions are what are called your value chain emissions outside of electricity. So it could be anything that occurs upstream for a company that, to operate. So that can be anything from employees commuting to work to business travel. So you are using, or were using the airplanes to fly to business meetings. You might be purchasing goods that were produced by another company. And there might be transport of your goods. So those are all the kinds of upstream activities which are outside of your control, but are still emissions that occur as a result of the activities of your own company. And then similarly, we have downstream activities, which are also considered scope 3 activities. So that could be anything around the use or processing of the products that you sell, through to end-of-life treatment of sold products, transport of products, etc. I think a very important one for this audience, and I'm talking the you, sort of a royal you or a general you, but in the case of asset managers, the scope 3 emissions associated with investments is the critical one that we have to think about. So as an investment manager, our own emissions might be fairly low, but it might just be some office electricity that's consumed, or maybe we own a vehicle or 2 or 3. So those emissions may be fairly small, but we also have to take cognizance of the emissions from our investments. And I think we've started to bring this message through this training, but I just want to reiterate it, that the quantification of those emissions is important. Now, there's guidance on how one quantifies emissions associated with investments that can allow one to look at that scale that scope of emissions and how large the scale of them might be. A further point I wanted to make before I moved on from the slide was that we often talk about carbon dioxide as our main greenhouse gas. So carbon dioxide is in fact the largest greenhouse gas by volume that's emitted into the atmosphere, and it comes from combustion of fossil fuels and industrial processes, etc., etc. But we also have other greenhouse gas emissions that are given off. So there's methane, there's nitrous oxide, there's hydrofluorocarbons, there's perfluorocarbons, there's SF6 sulfur, hexafluorine, and NF3 as well. So those are the main greenhouse gas emissions that are considered under the Kyoto Protocol, and there are various other gases as well. But one really has to look at reporting on all of our greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide. Many of these are more powerful greenhouse gases than CO2 is, even if the volumes are smaller. I think I've got a question in the chat. Let me see if I can see what that question is.
Brett, it's a comment from Brett.
Yes. Can you read that to me? I'm not able to see it right now.
Happy to. So Brent's comment is CDP found that finance scope 3 emissions are around 700 times larger than scope 1 and 2 emissions from financial entities. Brent, I'm not sure if you wanted to comment further on that.
Thanks, Adrian. No, I was just reiterating Brett's point that for a financial institution, really most of your risk, and one of the key metrics to manage and to track and also to try and manage is your finance emissions. That's where most of the exposure is going to be, and also where most of your impact on in terms of climate change is going to be.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Brent. Yeah, the scale is multiple orders of magnitude. Thank you for adding to that. Agreed. Okay, so that is the idea of reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and I spent a bit of time on that because that is core to reporting and is highly recommended in terms of the TCFD. But then that, of course, is not the only metrics that we report on. So other metrics that are chosen by the organization seeking to report to align with a strategy and a risk management process particular to them. We use a combination of both historical and forward-looking metrics. So historical metrics to show where we've come from, because we want to show progression towards reducing our impacts and towards maximizing on the positive aspects of opportunities, climate-related opportunities. And then, of course, we want to look at forward-looking metrics to demonstrate our intent. It's also important to note, and I think this is a point that we try and stress throughout talking to you about the TCFD, is that the TCFD reporting process is a journey. We don't start and provide full quantitative information initially, but it's important to recognize that just because we don't have full quantitative information, we shouldn't report. We are also able to make qualitative disclosures to supplement or act as a proxy for quantitative data. So, and that qualitative information that we present in our early TCFD reports may evolve over time to become quantitative information as we have more information available to us, or it may not, or we may carry on reporting qualitatively if appropriate. So I think that there's, as I said, there's a wide range of metrics that people can use in the TCFD, but some examples that might be relevant here are things like what proportion of our assets and our activities are materially exposed to physical climate risks. So that's all the risks Seren spoke to you about earlier of droughts and floods and extreme weather events. It might be credit exposure to fossil fuels or other high-risk investments. What proportion of our assets or activities are aligned towards climate-related opportunities? So the first one suggests a risk. The second one talks to opportunities. So those are the kinds of metrics that we might talk about in terms of investment or where monetary flows are going. But we might also talk about what proportion of our senior management remuneration is impacted by climate consideration. So do we actually put out there a bonus or a component of remuneration that needs to be linked to climate of sorts, whatever that might look like? Or are we actually investing money in terms of addressing our climate risks and opportunities. So are we working towards addressing some of those risks or opportunities? So there's a wealth of metrics that we can use in terms of assessing in terms of disclosure, in terms of this TCFD. So Liberty Mutual, an investment house in the US, speaks to total investments in traditional energy and total investments in alternative energy sources. And through reporting on historical metrics, they are showing progress. So they show that they went up in terms of the investment in alternative energy sources. They, factor of 3 odd that they used, that they increased that investment, whereas at the same time they are far more slowly, but still reducing the total investment in traditional energy. So this might be a fairly simple representation of our metrics for investment in fossil fuels and alternative energy sources, a risk and an opportunity. I quite like this one, which was Citibank. They provide a far more detailed, what they call their climate risk heat map and credit exposure, where they break down their investments in a whole lot of different sectors, both the kind of oil and gas sector, but they do also have alternative energy here. They talk about utility investment and various investments in transportation. And in fact, this table goes on over, I think, 2 or 3 pages in their TCFD exposure report. The TCFD disclosure, not exposure report. And so you can see exactly where their money is invested. They talk about the total in 2020, some historical figures is over here as well, the percentage of total exposure, how much is funded, percentage of funded exposure. And then they give the quantitative information, but they also give a fairly qualitative or semi-qualitative indication of the risks associated with these investments. So you can crunch the absolute numbers, but you can also see here that the energy and commodities is a very high risk component of their portfolios in terms of transition risks. So if they're taxes or penalties or policies around climate change, they will be affected, but they don't consider the physical risk to be as high for many of them. So they are moderate risks. This one's a low risk. So they don't expect it to be impacted by climate change as much physically. Power, you can see the alternative energy, and the other is a low transition risk. They've got a range of moderate risks here, but of course, for a whole lot of the fossil sectors, they're high risks. And then a similar example there for transportation. So we can immediately start to get a sense of where Citi's risk goes. So this is repeating what Seren said to you earlier, but I thought it was worthwhile just reiterating the point here, is that metrics can be expressed in different ways. So we can talk about absolute emissions, that's how much scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions are given out, and that's the total climate impact of our loans and investments. And this sets a baseline for our climate action. We might choose to express our metrics as a economic emissions intensity. So this allows us to compare portfolios, because if we don't have the same investment in different parts of our portfolio, we can express our emissions as for example, a tons of CO2 per equivalents per million euros invested, for example. So that's an emissions intensity. Of course, we can also express our other metrics as intensities, as absolutes. We then have physical emissions intensities. Here we talk about a tons per megawatt hour, or a tons of CO2 per ton of product. So this allows us to see what our efficiency are in terms of a common output. And then, of course, there's the weighted average carbon intensity, which I think Sarah mentioned to you as well, which allows you to understand our exposure to carbon intensive companies. So that's tons of CO2 per million euros of company revenue, for example. So different metrics give you different senses of your emissions performance, and it depends on what you're trying to do with those numbers. So it's quite valuable when setting up metrics and interpreting metrics to understand what you want them to tell you, or what these metrics are telling you about your emissions intensity. But as I mentioned now, it can also be around, you can use other metrics as well in terms of intensities in different ways. Okay, so that's just a little bit more detail on metrics. And now I want to spend a few minutes looking at the subject of targets. Now, our targets, in the same way as our metrics, have to be aligned with what we are trying to achieve by in terms of our strategy and our risk processes for our organization. This will then follow into setting our targets. What are we trying to achieve in terms of alignment of our organization or our portfolio with transition towards being responsive and resilient to climate change? So the kinds of targets we might set are listed in this table, and I'll pick out one or two examples of them in the interests of time. But of course you will get slides, and these are available more broadly. But the obvious thing that people do is they'll set emissions targets. So here you'll see the example they give here is to move to a net zero target by 2050, but also to set an interim target to cut emissions by 70% relative to 2015 by 2035. So an emissions target is one that is used quite extensively and is often the starting point for organizations wanting to set targets for themselves. And the next example is one where maybe a company puts an internal shadow carbon price in place to allow it to begin to respond its models to potential changes in policy. So you might put that as a target. What other examples do I want to put up here? This one, reduce percentage of asset value exposed to transition risks by 2030. You'll note that many of these include a baseline, so it is quite important to specify what it's relative to that you're reducing your 30% by. And then there are a couple of others here: increase amount of senior management remuneration impacted by climate change to 50% by 2025. That's quite a heavy weighting on climate change for managers to have that kind of weighting on their remuneration. And then investment in renewable energy, etc. So we set targets that are relevant to our organization. And I think that the other consideration around setting targets is that one has to think about what type of time horizons we set targets over, because this has implications for us financially, and will also determine the kinds of targets that we might set. And Saren's going to be talking to you in a moment about an example of one example of approaches to setting climate change targets. But I mean, we might just set very short-term targets, the 0 to 2 year target cycle, which will help inform our operating plans and our budgets. And this will have very direct implications for us financially. You know, it'll impact on actual climate change, on current revenues and costs, current values of assets and liabilities. We may choose to also implement 2 to 5 year targets, which talks a little bit more of the strategic planning elements of our business, where we go towards project planning or strategic projects and initiatives. And this will obviously then push out some of the projections and estimates of potential returns on some of our longer term projects. But then companies also set targets for the longer term, for the 5 to 10 year and more than 10 year time periods. And this is towards more of the strategic thinking. So it allows us to inform strategic planning and strategic thinking. And this is where we move more into the realm of understanding financial implications within more of a scenarios type of thinking, where we think what this could imply for us in a rather longer term, uncertain future. And it's appropriate for organizations to set both, everything from the short term to the very long term targets to ensure that they're thinking about the complexity of risks and opportunities over all time periods for the organization. Of course, I just want to stress the point that we don't do this all in our first financial disclosure. And as investors, we don't expect companies to start looking for, 0 to 30-year time horizons on targets. People start off slowly. They start off with maybe setting some qualitative targets or very short-term targets or very tentative targets around their greenhouse gas emissions. And really this, when one gets into something that has this range of targets, one is looking at a far more developed TCFD report. So please don't think this is what would be expected of South African companies just starting out on their TCFD journey. So I want to show you one more slide before I carry on, one more example before I hand over back to Seren to talk about science-based targets. And this is an example of what Barclays has set in their TCFD report. And it's interesting to see here that they've set 2 types of targets. The first of these looks at financed emissions linked to energy. And here they talk about absolute emissions. This is the top graph I'm referring to. So this is the megatons. It's one of the types of targets that I mentioned to you, an absolute metric and then target. They show you where they are now in terms of their metric, and then look at where they want to get to in terms of 2040 and compare themselves to an OECD benchmark. So they want to be lower than the OECD benchmark in terms of their absolute financed emissions. And then they also set a target and a metric, a linked metric in terms of their power financed emissions. So this is overall energy. The bottom one is just power. And here they use an emissions intensity as their metric, and then the target setting as well. And they express that as a kilogram of CO2 per megawatt hour. And you'll see that once again declines relative to a benchmark. So it's a mixture of approaches depending on what they're trying to monitor and fit for purpose metrics. So that allows me to hand over to Seren to talk to you about science-based targets. Mel, I don't know how we're tracking on time, whether you want to allow time for some questions now, or would you like to get to the end of this and scenarios and then go into questions?
Yeah, I see we are actually running quite behind on time. So maybe, yeah, I'm not too sure. Are there any burning questions that people want to ask related to the metrics and targets at this stage?
The other option, Mel, if you would like, sorry, is people, unless they would like to speak, they could put their questions in the chat and I could try and answer in the chat.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do that approach. Those that have questions, please do feel free to ask it in the chat box, and Brett will respond as Seren's presenting. Thanks.
Okay, Seren, all yours.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for that very informative session. I'm going to share my screen now. So let me just check with you guys if you can all see my screen. And if it's in presentation mode.
Yes,
yeah.
We can see.
Fantastic. So very interesting session on metrics and targets. And that would feed into this next part of today's agenda, which is on science-based targets, which is a helpful initiative that supports organizations in setting targets. And as the name implies, the targets are set or grounded in science. So the background to the science-based targets, it's an initiative that is a global effort and a collaboration between key stakeholders such as CDP, which we've mentioned numerous times on the workshop today, the UN Global Compact, and WWF, as well as it's part of the We Mean Business Coalition. The We Mean Business Coalition, if you've never heard of them before, is a coalition intended to embed the implementation of the Paris Agreement in the real economy. So the SBTs has been going for a number of years now. And while the SBT initiative is aiming to have GHG emission reduction targets setting, target setting that will become standard business practice. This is all in the guise of the Paris Agreement and moving towards achieving those objectives and achieving even more ambitious targets in the Paris Agreement as we move towards that race for net zero. Some of the advantages of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is that it's a credible approach that helps unlock certain business benefits. Firstly, it's a rigorous and credible sustainable commitments that companies set. It helps in terms of consolidated and practical approaches to action on and disclosure, and it provides a transparent, proactive management of operational and regulatory risks. So it complements TCFD in a number of ways, and the initiative, if you reach out to them, you can engage with them, and they can then help you with, looking at these components. Further to this, the fact that it's grounded in science makes it more credible. Also, being part of the SBTIs enhances the credibility because they use it's the best available science. It's contextualized to the Earth's limits and societal goals, and the targets are measurable and time-bound, which is something that Brett mentioned in the previous section that's important when you're setting targets. Science-based targets, it unlocks a roadmap to act for people to help them in disclosing how they prioritize and mobilize action. It's aligned with guidance around financial disclosures, which I'll talk to in a moment. And if for people who are looking to issue sustainability-linked bonds, the SBTIs is considered one of the best key performance indicators to use as part of sustainability-linked bonds. And of course, it's aligned with the UN SDGs, and it's working alongside the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as well as the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a similar task force to TCFD, but kind of beyond the scope of our workshop today. So what are the science-based targets? Well, corporate greenhouse gas emission targets that are consistent with the level of ambition that, according to climate science, is required to meet the long-term temperature goals set in the Paris Agreement. Now, the SBT's science-based targets are moving from the Paris Agreement towards a company-level target. So we go from mitigation goals in the global economy towards company-level goals that cover the most relevant emissions as part of the company's value chain. These targets are expressed as long-term goals, and the time frame that ensures accountability and drives action can range between 5 to 15 years. It's expressed in temperature metrics in the Paris Agreement, and then translated to SBTs. It's expressed in metrics that are relevant for the sector and company. And I think Brent touched on this a few times in his presentation about how you need to make sure that the metrics and targets that you use are relevant for your company or your organization, your financial institution. But having an initiative or a partner like the SBTIs to guide you, make sure that the targets you set are relevant for you, but also these are things that investors will be looking at to help them make their investment decision. And you can't, so it's kind of guiding you to not pick frivolous metrics and targets, things that you could achieve without doing anything. It's guiding you to select targets that are practical but are also relevant in fighting and managing climate-related risks. This slide shows the long-term kind of trajectory of where you're heading in terms of your target. So you've got greenhouse gases on your vertical axis, and you've got time on your horizontal axis there. As we move forward in time, we should see a lowering of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just one example of potential target, but this is probably the most important one. It's around greenhouse gas emissions. And you see here that by hopefully around 2050, but this time frame could be relevant to an organization that looks to set more ambitious targets to move that to 2040 or 2045, that you will reach net zero. And in the interim, you should also have targets, which is these other yellow dotted lines in the middle. So this is a great part of SBTIs and science-based targets, is that the long-term targets are clear, but the interim targets are also clear. And this is very important for management to help track progress along the way. There are some companies already in South Africa who adopted these science-based targets, and this is just a few of them. For some companies, targets have been set, while for others, so far, they've just committed to setting targets. And there's examples of targets shown there. I want to touch on the resources used by SBTs and the technical concepts that these resources speak to. As you might have been seeing, climate change accounting and climate change definitions can get quite technical, and that's part of the reasons why we're doing these workshops and webinars, is to help educate the public on the various different aspects of climate change. And when it comes to setting targets, that can also become a bit technical for people involved in other industries that are not climate scientists or experts. And the SBTIs is great as an initiative in helping their members to understand these technical concepts. So they use the greenhouse gas protocol, which is mentioned a few times, and then they use standards and settings of frameworks for corporate value chain accounting for scope 3 emissions. And they've got very good technical knowledge to be able to guide companies in setting their targets for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. There are a few concepts and questions that SBTIs put forward in helping companies set their targets. These elements are shown on screen and help the various different managers of companies with the process of setting targets. So importance to questions to ask, as you can see, is also questions that are shown earlier in part of TCFD. So this is definitely a complement to what we've been showing so far. So some of the questions include the baseline carbon footprint, baseline carbon intensity, emission hotspots in the value chain, where in the value chain should focus action, and how much will the business grow. So as you can see throughout the day, there's a lot of interlinking concepts, and we reinforce certain things. So these kind of things have been coming up throughout the day via the recommendations, via the session where we did a deep dive into metrics and targets, and the science-based targets initiative also is aligned to what we've been showing so far.
Siren?
Yes.
Apologies for interjecting here, but I'm just mindful of time, and I know Brett still has the scenario section to go. So I'm wondering if you won't awfully mind, us progressing into the scenario session, because I do recall Brett having a few questions regarding some of the inputs he'd value from some of the participants as it relates to the toolkit development. So I'm wondering.
No, that's no problem, Mirani. I'll finish off on this last slide, which is just to say that for our audience today, that the SBTIs have specific targets that look at the financial sector. So there's science-based targets for financial institutions. And I think that's a very nice point to kind of close it up on why SBTIs is important, but why SBTIs is also could be helpful for our audience today. So I'll close off there. I'm not sure if you want to...
No, maybe let's skip that poll for now. But I think if people have any additional questions on science-based targets, they're most welcome to engage Siren and WWF on that. They really know their stuff. So yeah, welcome to engage Siren on that directly.
Cool.
Brett,
All right.
would you like to share your screen?
Yes, Melanie, thanks. I will share mine now. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that the science-based targets discussion, and really, if we've got time in the Q&A, I think we should carry on with that discussion if possible. So thanks for that, and sorry to cut you short as well, so on that one. Okay, so just to carry on with the last element of the TCFD framework is around this idea of scenarios, and I think that will then bring our discussion to a close, or our formal presentation to a cose, and then we can move into the Q&A section. I think you will recall from Saren's earlier presentation that the strategy pillar of the TCFD includes the exploration of future scenarios. Now, many of you will know what a scenario is, because you will have come across it in various elements of your work. But scenario analysis is a tool which we use to enhance critical thinking or strategic thinking by looking at various paths into the future. So we bring together descriptions of the future to highlight central elements of them, and then to draw attention to key factors that will impact on us moving into the future. Scenarios aren't absolute forecasts or predictions, but are rather hypothetical constructs that provide us with a tool to explore these key future factors and to challenge our conventional wisdom about the future. And these help us to explore alternatives that alter a basis for business as usual assumptions. So I won't spend too much time on the slide in the interests of time, but to just realize that there are various principles that guide the development of scenarios. We want them to be plausible. Obviously, it's got to be a realistic description of the future. If we're going to be exploring multiple scenarios, we want them to be distinctive between the different scenarios. They must make sense as well, consistency within them, relevant to what we're trying to explore, and also to challenge our perceptions of the future from what we currently perceive as business as usual. Now, those are sort of common scenario constructs that we've spoken about, but we just wanted to mention briefly the use of scenarios in a climate context. And this diagram I thought was quite nice on what are the scenarios that one could explore as part of one's TCFD disclosure, and then obviously the portfolio's resilience under these different scenarios. And the scenarios that we might explore range from the left-hand side, the red scenarios, where there's very little transition risk. So there's very little action that's taken around climate change. We hit very large temperature increases with the resultant impact on the climate and on the planet. So we won't be faced with the transition elements, but we certainly will be impacted by the physical elements of climate change, or the physical risks of climate change. So that might be one scenario that we explore, a business as usual scenario. And we might explore some scenarios sort of in the middle, where we've got some action, where we've got a bit more action on climate change, thereby increasing the transition risks, but reducing the physical risks. And finally, hitting a scenario where we manage to achieve a 1.5 or a net zero future, but of course with the very high transition risks that we need to consider. So this is just a demonstration of what scenario analysis might look like in the climate area. And then another slide, which again I won't spend much time on, but we will really sort of explore under a scenario everything from temperature to what are the implications for our physical hazards and our transition shocks, what does this imply for our value chain, and then we might choose to do the analysis to varying levels of detail. We might have a look at just quantitative information, We might look at qualitative information and how this impacts on us just with respect to a single underlying asset or a group of underlying assets, through to individual firms, through to individual sectors or asset classes, to countries or regions. So scenario analysis is a term used to embody a range of different analyses that we can do to understand future climate impacts and risks and opportunities. You know, in the scenario, in the TCFD framework, we noticed that that's kind of part of step 2, and or pillar number 2, whereas our metrics and targets are pillar number 4. It's important to realize that scenario analysis can very strongly impact on our choices of metrics and targets. So I introduced the metrics and targets component of this first because we thought it was valuable, because people often start with some simple and shorter term metrics and targets. But it's important to recognize that there's an iterative process between doing your scenario analysis and setting the metrics and targets. So you may very well revisit them once you've engaged with the scenario analysis for an underlying companies and investment, or for investments as a whole. The complexity of analysis we go into is determined by what we hope to do and our skills that we have available to us, because we've heard feedback and we do recognize that scenario analysis is about the most challenging of all of the components of the TCFD disclosure framework. So for that reason, under the UK PACT project, we've organized a dedicated scenario analysis workshop. I think it is confirmed now for the 30th of September from 2 till 5, presented by Raf Chaskalskin from Vivid Economics. And there they will go through the all elements that one needs to think about in terms of scenario analysis. So I would encourage you to attend that if it interests you. So that brings us to the end of our formal presentations. So we have 3 more polls that we are going to go into now, but it's really within the context of stimulating the final Q&A session and discussion session. And part of the question that we really would like to ask you is, what do you think we need in South Africa to help support increased climate-related financial disclosure and assessment of the disclosures in South Africa? So there's the disclosure by companies, there's the assessment by asset managers, and so we've got 3 poll questions as to what do you think are the greatest challenges, is the first question, and then we'll put up the next 2. And then we would like this to prompt the discussion. So think about your answers to this, and then let's go into either the Q&A on what we presented now, or into your feedback. Because you may remember right at the beginning of this presentation, we did say that this whole project is user-driven. So if there are areas of CFD that you think we could cover, that we could help support in South Africa, it would be very useful to know what those are. So yeah, if we can get some responses, what do you think is the greatest challenge to see climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa? We've got a couple who have said access to emissions data from individual companies, and lack of guidance on how to interpret CFD information in the local context was also raised by one participant. So thank you for those responses. We'll give it another moment. Yeah, Mel, please go ahead.
Just in terms of that question, I mean, this is something I'm now thinking about. We gave people the option to say access to emissions data from individual companies. It'll be interesting for me to hear which specific emissions data, does it relate to scope 1, 2, or 3? And my assumption would be it relates to scope 3. So whoever kind of wants to add to that, or wants to guide us, I think it'll be great if you guys can be a bit more specific as to which specific scope, if I'm assuming right. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mel. So yeah, we can certainly get into that in the discussion. What kind of data is useful? Okay, great. So that's interesting on the first poll is really what is the data that's lacking. So it will be great to hear from people around that. Availability of service providers, 2 people, and lack of guidance as 1 person. Okay, so Farka, maybe let's go through the poll questions, and then we'll get to the discussion. So the next question is, what data sets focusing specifically on South Africa would be useful to you? So are you interested in information on South Africa's international climate commitments? Maybe you know that already. Information on our local climate policy context. We recognize that there can be a bit of a quagmire for those who are starting to engage with it. So maybe some condensed information there, an understanding of what the implications of climate policy are for individual companies operating in South Africa, or maybe you're interested in the academic research. Maybe you don't know where to start to really get your head around climate change and South Africa, its implications for South Africa. Okay, that's great. So a lot of focus on the implications of climate policy for individual companies operating in South Africa. And indeed, it is a challenge because I think it's quite an area which is not very clear. So part of our intention behind this project is to try and provide some more guidance based on what we know, because it's not always clear from government what the specific implications are, but there are aspects that we are starting to understand. We, of course, understand the carbon tax, and although we might not know where it's going entirely, we at least know that there is a tax in place, and there are some indications of where carbon budgets are going. So we're going to try and provide information on that as far as possible as part of this project. So thank you for those responses. I think, Safaka, we've got one more, and then we'll go into open Q&A. So what calculations or tools or guidance could be useful to you? So you'll see there's kind of, we've asked about what is missing. We've asked about what kind of guidance document, what kind of information documents are potentially valuable. Are there any kind of tools that you would like specific tools you'd like to play with? So you have some examples here, but if you've got any other ideas, that would be welcome. Okay, I think looking at the responses now, I think we're starting to see, of course, you would have all noticed that that question does link to the question of, are we missing information on emissions from companies? And of course, that would then make sense that a lot of you are responding to that being guidance on information, finding information on emissions from companies. Okay, I think we've got quite a nice set of responses there. So that's very useful. Thank you. And we will pull together the results of these polls as well as from the other training sessions we're running to help guide our work in this area. So I think what we've, Adrian, Mel, my understanding is we've got a couple of minutes left for general Q&A. Is that right? Adrian, do you want to facilitate that? I'm not seeing anything coming through on the chat, but if people want to either just put up their hands.
Yeah. We do have time for Q&A. We are obviously in the kind of final stretch of the workshop. So thanks everybody for sticking with us. And we hope that you've benefited from the various presentations which have been provided today. Can we ask that you either use the chat function or you raise your hand, unmute yourself, and we'd welcome any questions that you might have. You're welcome to direct those to any specific speaker. Maybe given Brett's presentation now, you've got a few follow-on questions. Please would you use this opportunity to direct questions to either Brett or Seren or Milani or Brent. And if I can also just draw your attention, please, to the post-workshop online survey, which we would like to use for feedback purposes. Please, can you also just take 5 minutes to complete that as we start to wrap up? But let's hear from you. Are there any specific questions that might have been prompted as a result of today's workshop and maybe some of these more later afternoon presentations? Not seeing any hands or any questions coming through in the chat function. Does that mean that the facilitators are allowed to pose questions to the participants?
Adrian, and I'm also then assuming that the facilitators did a good job in presenting very clearly on the concepts they presented on.
Of course, if we can say so ourselves.
Okay, can I ask a question, Adrian? Oh, there is one, sorry, come through in the chat box.
Thanks, Mila. So the question isn't directed to anybody in specific, but the question is, are there any tools available to flex a portfolio's exposure to the different climate change scenarios? Brett, I'm not sure if you or Seren want to answer that.
Either way, from my side, Mila, nothing that I've come across that sort of is a directly applicable tool to do this. It's often left in the hands of sort of people who have got models that they've built up for this purpose, and then they can run a portfolio exposure to different scenarios. So we haven't come across anything that allows one to do it, you know, that an asset manager can use to assess their companies. But perhaps Brent or Seren has come across something similar, something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Brett, and thanks for the question, Mila. The tools for the South African data set, I think, are a bit lacking. So I've seen a tool from the 2 Degrees initiative called PACTA, Paris Agreement Capital Transition Analysis, but the data seems to be a bit limited for the South African scope. So there aren't any tools, you know, that I know that are freely available that can do this, but there could be some consultants that can work with you to help do some scenario analysis. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Brett. Yeah, I'll also just chime in there. I completely agree with what Brett and Seren has said. I think the things to emphasize is most of the data, I think the data needed to do the analysis is more freely available than people realize for large listed companies. I think as you go into the unlisted space, into the smaller companies, other asset classes, it becomes more complicated. And that's one of the reasons why we embarked on this exercise of Vivid Economics to show that it is possible, because most of the data providers, Truecost, Standard and Poor, and all these other providers, as part of their standard ESG data sets, they typically do have emissions data for both of the large listed stocks internationally. But then, as Brett mentioned, in order to do the analysis on a portfolio, you need both those emissions information and also information about how markets will, you expect markets to evolve, physical impacts, the value thereof, and so on. And that typically at this stage sits with with a couple of consulting companies. As I mentioned, there's players like Truecost, like Sustainalytics, also Vivid Economics and Planetrix, who we'll be partnering with that provide these services. But unfortunately, to iterate what Brett and Seren were saying, I don't think there's anything. There's a couple of resources you could use for specific purposes, but as a kind of one-stop shop tool, unfortunately at this stage, it really sits with the with the kind of big consultancies with the large data sets.
I see. Thank you very much, Brent, for that response as well. I see Seren has also suggested that there's a 2 Degrees investing resource, PACTA, which you may want to look at. Hopefully that will also be beneficial. So thanks very much, Mila, for your question. Do we have a second question for our presenters? I'm not seeing any hands raised or any further questions coming through. Perhaps just to mention then, if hopefully you found today's workshop useful. I'm sure on behalf of all the participants, you wouldn't mind me extending your thanks to our presenters and the speakers. A big thank you to Brent for introducing the project. And then a special thanks to our presenters, Seren Mardere from WWF South Africa, Milani Smith from Six Capitals Advisory, and Professor Brett Cohen from the Greenhouse. Hopefully, if you found today useful, please do encourage your colleagues and anybody else that you might think would benefit from attending one of the other virtual workshops planned for this month on the same content, please would you direct them to the registration page that you would have used, so that they can attend our workshops which are happening next week. I think we've got one taking place next week, Tuesday on the 14th of September, and then again on Monday, the 20th of September. So please do encourage others to join. We'll be running similar content workshops for retirement fund trustees. The first one taking place on Thursday this week. So if you don't mind me doing a bit of advertising, we would love to have a full house at those workshops as we've had today. On behalf of the project team then, it's just again that final request to ask that you please complete the post-workshop feedback form via that SurveyMonkey link. It's something that we do need to provide to our funders, South Africa UK Pact. And again, just on our behalf, on our part, thank you so much for joining us today. And please do visit the project website via the DNA website, where you're able to access all of those project resources, like the climate risk fact sheets, which you had a look at in today's session. So from my side, a thank you to our speakers, thank you to our participants for joining, thank you for your active participation, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully at the climate scenario workshop, the afternoon of the 30th of September from 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock. With that, let me just ask you, are there any final comments or questions that any of our other presenters would like to make? All good. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day further, and we look forward to seeing you at our next opportunity to engage. Have a good day further. All the best. Bye-bye.